Chapter 227. 3 hours before Natha left the village, in the early morning of November 3rd, a secret meeting was held in a manor called Moloch. This manor was located in the northern part of Ifta territory, close to the Lars mountain range. The entire territory also belonged to an earl named Owen Britt. Earl Owen owned a relatively vast land because it was close to the border. He had many knight territories under his command. In terms of military strength alone, he could rank in the top 3 in the territory. At this time, the meeting in the manor of Moloch was presided over by this earl. The firewood in the fireplace was crackling, but several people sitting in the hall looked cold and serious. Revenge is inevitable, but so far, who can tell me who killed Lord Ansedin? My men have been sent out, but we have lost contact. My team is on the way, and we should have the answer soon. Except for Earl Owen, the other 3 noble lords in the hall at this time were all barons. Their territories were scattered all over Ifta, and they had almost no contact with each other. But at this time they gathered together because of the only thing they had in common. These 4 lords were all puppets controlled by Ansedin with the soul extraction potion. After staying in the kingdom of Karen for 17 years, Ansedin, who had the title of genius pharmacist, would naturally not only modify Viscount Tranca, but also not only deal with Earl Durant. After 17 years of hard work, Ansedin's infiltration of the kingdom of Karen was no longer limited to Ifta, the Duke's territory. The nobles and other institutions that had contact, and transactions with him had already spread all over the kingdom. If a war really broke out, the resources, controlled by this necromancer, would definitely bring unimaginable damage to the kingdom. Fortunately, everything was stopped by Roddy now. Although the only puppet lord had died, as puppets who had signed a soul contract, as long as Ansedin's soul was not destroyed, they still had to continue to fulfill the contract. To put it simply, they had to avenge the puppet lord, Ansedin, and continue to carry out their unfinished mission. Compared to the other nobles who were indifferent and ambiguous, the 4 lords obviously had no way out. Therefore, the only topic between them was how to take revenge. Ongmar is old and muddle-headed. He doesn't care about Kyger Town. Currently, he has placed all his resources on the western defense line, so now many people are eyeing Taranka's territory. Earl Owen, we just received news that Taraka is dead. Dead? The voice paused for a moment and then heaved a sigh of relief. Then Keg Town will completely become an ownerless land. There will be many people fighting over it. Why don't we take this opportunity? Although they had become puppets, their brains were as good as before. They were still proficient in conspiracies and political struggles. After a simple discussion, some information was gradually summarized. It seems to have something to do with the Baron called Sodeler. Then check it out. Also, pay attention to the movements of the Rose Cross. They have never concealed their hostility towards the Tasman Kingdom. If these religious lunatics are involved, I'm afraid things will be very difficult. After talking for a while, they reached a consensus on some issues. The warm fire in the fireplace dispelled the cold, but the nobles with the heart of the undead hid their faces under their hoods. What are we going to do after the revenge is over? Hearing this, a few of their pale faces immediately revealed some bewilderment. After a brief silence, Earl Owen slowly said, "We will continue Lord Ansedin's research. Whether the results are good or bad, we will report it to His Majesty Augustine." His voice turned from loud to soft, and then his words were almost inaudible. Lord Ansedin searched for clues about the charged crystal in the Lars mountain range. Presumably, His Majesty Augustine also needs this. With these words, the remaining lords finally had a backbone. They nodded silently and dispersed in all directions. In the cold air, these nobles who had inherited Ansedin's last wish stepped onto the carriages to return to their territories and began to prepare for their plot. Time passed. 3 hours later, Natha, who had sensed that the atmosphere in the forest was not right, had already left the village and walked towards the place where the sound came from. The sound in front of her became more and more obvious. Natha clenched the short bow, but a question popped up in her mind involuntarily. If Roddy was here, what would he do? After witnessing Roddy's battle scene, Natha was deeply affected and could no longer avoid this mode of thinking. Even though there was resentment in her heart, she had long been deeply convinced by Roddy's strength. So, Roddy's fighting habits had become a benchmark in Natha's subconscious. She stopped and listened carefully. She heard some familiar sounds in the wind. Natha recalled Roddy's choice, turned around and climbed up the trunk next to her. After the field of vision suddenly widened, she immediately saw the scene in the distance. However, it was also at this moment that a scream suddenly sounded in the forest. A black shadow descended from the sky at lightning speed, bringing with it a sky full of leaves, and at the same time, it struck a running wood elf. The figure that was sent flying spun and landed on the ground. There was a huge wound on its back that was badly mutilated. Natha focused her eyes and saw that it was Randolph on the ground. The young hunters from the village were also running towards her. At this moment, they were completely scared out of their wits and ran away from the sudden attack of the black shadow. As the black shadow swooped down again, Natha finally saw clearly that it was a giant black crow with red eyes. Flying magical beast in the past, Natha would definitely run as far as she could from such a creature. However, this time, she only hesitated for a second before she dashed towards Randolph's location. She also raised the short bow in her hand and shot 3 arrows at the black crow. The arrows that were shot while running were not very accurate, but because of this, the black crow's attention was attracted by Natha. It let out a strange cry and suddenly flapped its wings and flew towards her. Natha, who was running on a branch that was 7 to 8 meters high, seemed to be pouncing towards the black crow. However, at this moment, Natha did not feel much panic. She quickly stopped on the thick trunk, nocked an arrow, drew the bow, and took aim. The black crow could cover a distance of more than 50 meters in less than a second, but Natha completed all the preparations in less than a second. Her fingers pulled the bowstring back and the arrow shot out. The black crow did not rush around like ordinary magical beasts. After seeing Natha's action, it actually immediately dodged to the side. However, this fell right into Natha's trap. After feinting the arrow, she directly threw away the short bow and pulled out a dagger. She leaped up, pounced forward, and their figures crisscrossed. On the ground, Randolph endured the pain that almost made him faint and watched the scene unfold in front of him. Natha, who jumped down from the tree, did not have any buffer along the way. She landed on the ground and rolled a few times before she managed to stop her body. She seemed to be in a slightly sorry state. Chapter 228. The hustle and bustle in the forest quietened down, followed by a series of footsteps. Not far away, the holy knights who had received the warning were lined up in a formation and charging towards them. Randolph, who was lying on the ground, tried his best to open his eyes, as though he couldn't accept what had just happened. The 2 wood elves beside him were in awe of Natha's back. After landing on the ground, Natha stood up. Her originally steady breathing was slightly hurried. Her hand that was holding the dagger was numb, and her mind seemed to be echoing with the sound of the wind when she brushed past the black crow. Only when she lowered her head and saw that her body was unscathed did she gradually accept a fact. I really killed that black crow. Natha had never imagined such a thing before. She tried hard to recall the feeling in that instant, and realized that she remembered the scene when Roddy was fighting. Using an arrow to lure the enemy, forcing the enemy to attack head-on, seizing the only chance of contact to defeat the enemy in one strike. Against the puppets, against the gargoyles, against Magda, he had used this fighting style almost every time. Natha didn't expect that the first time she borrowed Roddy's fighting style and used it in actual combat, it would produce such a terrifying effect. The Black Crow, which was obviously suppressing Randolph and the others, was defeated in just one round. This wasn't a coincidence. What happened? She tried to calm her breathing and turned around to ask for the reason. Randolph couldn't care less about his injury and quickly replied, "We were attacked by it at the Guevara ruins. We thought we would be fine once we escaped from that area, but it chased us all the way and didn't stop. Rabin and Cardi were injured, we couldn't stop it at all." Randolph couldn't help but feel a little ashamed when he said this. A total of 7 of the strongest hunters in the village were defeated by the Black Crow along the way, and in the end, Natha defeated the Black Crow in one move. The gap between them was really unbelievable. After understanding the situation, Natha didn't talk to Randolph anymore, as though this elf who had pursued her for years was no different from a passerby. She adjusted her cloak, and her face was still calm, but when she turned around, her heart was filled with complicated emotions. Is this how Roddy teaches people? Did I really not realize it? She was still complaining before, but in the blink of an eye, the reality made her realize that she had become much stronger. Although this kind of thing could only make others proud, Natha always felt as if she had been slapped in the face. She wanted to criticize a little, but she felt that she had no right to do so. In the end, she could only sulk and walk away. Not far behind him, the paladins who were the backup plan slowly surrounded him. She looked for Buffon in order to alert them in advance to prevent a possible attack on Elsazelv. This idea was also a skill that she had learned from Rhodey. She did not realize that to be able to use this idea for her own use in just a few days, the talent represented was far beyond that of an ordinary person. The paladins who rushed over did not understand what had happened, but after examining Crow's corpse, they discovered something new. This isn't a magical beast. There are traces of arrays on its claws. Its eyes are red, and its body seems to be a little smelly. Although these paladins were not as good as the scouts, they had the advantage of high education and broad knowledge. So when they saw the crow killed by Natha, several older paladins immediately recognized what it was. It's a blood crow, a necromancer's summon. This conclusion made the paladins who had just fought with the skeleton look at each other. Therefore, in terms of the essence of energy, the foundation of all magical arts is the same. Among them, all magical arts, including elemental control, physical control, mental control, and so on, can be disassembled into the most basic arcane arts. Well, this is the meaning of this sentence. Let me analyze its sentence structure. You have seen the meaning of the words just now. The word foundation is pronounced as foundation. Roddy's words echoed in the manor's study, and in response, Akasha's voice seemed to stutter as she tried to read. This study was Roddy's current bedroom. After all, Sodeler was a baron, so he was arranged by Roddy to live in the most luxurious master bedroom next door. Sodeler, on the other hand, casually made a bed in this study and slept here for the past few days. At that moment, the two of them were sitting in front of the desk. There was a thick stack of parchment. Roddy's hands were quickly writing letters and words. Akasha, who was beside him, was frowning as she tried to remember everything that she saw. This scene lasted for more than an hour. Then, Roddy finally felt a little tired, so he stretched and ended this High Elves lesson. Knowing that the lesson was over, Akasha silently took the parchments and returned to her room. Not long after, she came back with boiled water and poured it for Roddy as usual. I told you before, don't always be like a maid. I can do these things myself. It's the same. Roddy flipped through the book, The Essence of Energy in the High Elves, and then sighed. I didn't expect your memory to be so good. There are no big schools in this era, or else you would definitely be a top student. Top student? What's that? After talking to Roddy for a while, she was clearly not as dull as before. The open-minded Akasha was actually more like a gentle girl next door. He's a guy who learns things quickly. Roddy shrugged. The school and classroom in his memory had completely left him. Looking at the medieval-style old furniture in front of him, there was a strange sense of alienation in his heart. By the way, is there any news from Hollier City? Akasha shook her head. She only had a rough understanding of Roddy's plan, but she did not know the details. At this time, she did not dare to say too much. Sensing her cautiousness, Roddy smiled and waved his hand. We're all on the same side, so there's no need to keep this plan a secret. To put it bluntly, I'm just making use of the situation. My own strength is not enough, so I can only contend with these people. There's a risk, but according to the nature of those nobles, it's probably not too big. I see, Akasha nodded, still not daring to say more. But after a few seconds she still mustered up the courage to ask, then do we continue to wait here? Chapter 229. Of course, Roddy wasn't talking about this topic with Akasha out of boredom. Although Akasha's definition was a healer, as a modern person, Roddy was very clear that if a team really wanted to cooperate with each other, a mechanical relationship between superior and subordinate would not work at all. A team that understood and trusted each other, and was willing to have common topics and goals would be able to exist healthily and actively. Of course, in the previous games, Roddy had never played the role of a leader, so he did not have much practical experience in building a strong team. For example, the theory mentioned in the previous sentence was also the knowledge that was imperceptibly brought out by the theorist in the forum. So it was not difficult to explain why Roddy talked about this sensitive topic. It seemed that his understanding of the word trust was probably at the level of sharing secrets. This time's matter is actually a show for Angmar. If we want to take down Geiger Town, we naturally have to pay a price. Ansiden's list of names can only be used as a reference. If we really want to catch all the traitors, just a piece of paper is far from enough. Roddy saw Akasha's somewhat dazed expression and knew that she was not good at thinking about such things. He could only pause for a moment and smiled. Then I'll change the topic. The book I taught you today wrote something about magic. Can you understand this? This was finally a field that Akasha was interested in. She had a good memory and was obsessed with magic, so the content of this book, the essence of energy, was indeed to her liking. After thinking for a moment, Akasha replied, I can only understand some concepts, but I think the things in this book are a little exaggerated. It is indeed exaggerated. The High Elves have always been a race of exaggerations, but I advise you to believe these exaggerated information. Roddy picked up the cup of water and drank a mouthful. These books may not seem eye-catching, but in order to get them, those grand mages would probably be willing to risk their lives. Akasha's eyes widened in surprise. After confirming that Roddy was not joking, she then realized what level the book was at. But after thinking for a moment, she asked doubtfully, but according to what it said, it seems that even magic can be counted as within the arcane system, and necromancy doesn't seem to be much different from magic. This theory surprised even Roddy. It really said that? How come I didn't see it? It's the part about magic structure. Akasha was a top student, and at this moment she could even recite that part of the passage. This made Roddy dumbfounded. But at the same time, he had to admit that although this healer looked dull, she really learned things at an exaggerated speed. Of course, this is only in theory. If it were to be put into practice, I'm afraid it would be a long way off. Getting a holy priest to cast the finger of death is probably not a practical thing. Roddy shrugged. In the 7 years before he transmigrated, he had never come into contact with anything like elemental theory. The concept of magic in his head basically came from the player's experience and the forum. If it was about the advanced and complicated magic knowledge in the game, he could be said to know nothing. Since you're interested, I'll leave the book with you first. If there are any words that you don't understand, feel free to ask me. Roddy thought for a moment, then reached out to take essence of energy and handed it to Akasha. He then grabbed a bundle of scrolls from the desk. You should be able to use these scrolls to carry them with you. In case of an accident, you can use them as a support. Thank you. Akasha was extremely surprised. Magic scrolls were absolutely rare items. For any spellcaster, they were almost a trump card. Roddy said that he would give her more than 10 scrolls. This made her not only pleasantly surprised, but also inexplicable satisfaction in her heart. After chatting casually for a while, Akasha carried these things back to her bedroom. It was still early, and the sentries outside the manor had already been replaced. Naturally, she did not have to continue watching over the manor. Realizing that there was nothing else to do, Akasha sat in front of the desk and continued to flip through the Essence of Energy book. The pale autumn sunlight shone into the room, and the precious scrolls that were stacked together left a messy row of shadows on the desk. However, what Roddy and Akasha did not notice was that among the scrolls that were supposed to be curse-type spells, there were 2 scrolls that were labeled Necromancer's Exclusive, that Roddy had inadvertently mixed in. Akasha was completely unaware of this. She lowered her head and read the high elf language that she had learned today. Her lips mimicked the letters and words that she had learned today. Occasionally, she would think of Roddy's words and could not help but frown. A holy priest casting a necromancy spell. Is such a thing possible? While the beautiful priestess was having doubts, in the holy cathedral of the Rose Cross Church thousands of miles away, a lecture on a similar topic was going on in the lecture hall. Regarding the essence of divine spells, this is my personal understanding. In theory, there is still more progress to be made, but as you all know, I prefer to start from a practical point of view. So, from the divine spells that I will show you, what can you see? It was a clean and bright square hall. A heavy historical atmosphere permeated the ancient building that was built 600 years ago. The Oakley Lecture Hall could accommodate 300 people, but there were only 20 to 30 people sitting there at the moment. The audience wore simple white robes, and most of them had unusually young faces. Stuart, what do you think? On the podium, a silver-haired but spirited old man raised his hand slightly. Not far from him, a young boy who looked to be only 15 years old softly answered the question. Professor George, I think that the divine spells of the light attribute may not necessarily be differentiated from the elements that the elementalists control. Perhaps under certain special conditions, the difference between them is not as deep as what we have now. Good idea. I have also tried to work towards the direction that you have mentioned, but until now, I have not found the special conditions. The professor on the podium had a scholarly demeanor. His words were gentle but powerful. But not finding does not mean that there is no such condition. Stuart, you have said it very well. Then, Miss Sally, what do you think? Professor George, since the name divine spells originated from the gods, why would they be compared to the elements? I have looked through many materials, and the books gave 2 completely different answers regarding the birth of the elements and the birth of the divine spells. The source of their power is different. If the end is summed up as the same point, although it appears to be true, is the main reason because of the change of the human will, and not the consciousness of the source of the power itself? Sally's answer was a rhetorical question. Her strong and independent character, coupled with her identity as the daughter of Duke, made her exuding a very charming temperament, so much so that the 15 to 16 years old young people in the hall could not help but look at her. Very good entry point. You have grasped 2 key points. Does the energy have consciousness? Here. In the afternoon, Professor George's speech finally came to an end. All of the talented young people in the lecture hall left after saluting. Sally picked up her books and relaxed her tired body. She looked at the schedule written on the parchment as she walked out of the lecture hall. This was the Holy Temple, the core of the Rose Cross that countless clergymen looked up to. Here, talent seemed to have become the most worthless thing. Sally was outstanding in the Ifta territory, but in the Holy Temple, her learning speed could not compare to those young classmates at all. Therefore, the only thing she could do was to study harder and try not to be left too far behind. Thinking about the books that she needed to read throughout the night, Sally rubbed her eyes. When she raised her head tiredly, she suddenly froze. In front of the St. Roland Church, a familiar figure was greeting her. "Lord Governor." Sally hurriedly saluted to Rubens. The latter smiled and raised his hand to stop her. Although it was a recommended relationship, because of Angmar and Roddy, Rubens could be said to trust and be close to Sally. At this moment, he was holding a letter in his hand. Sally had been staring at the letter ever since she saw him, so he simply handed it over and said, "With this kind of news, I'm sure you'll feel a little more at ease." After opening the dark red wax seal and reading the content, Sally quickly showed a surprised look. "Roddy actually killed that guy? He is not injured, right?" Such words made Rubens a little amused. "You are not worried about Angmar's safety." Seeing that Sally was a little embarrassed, he did not keep her in suspense. "Roddy is unharmed, and now he has become the focus of the church's attention. Many of the church's next actions will be related to him. I think those guys from Tasman will pay a terrible price for this." Hearing this, Sally could not help but be a little stunned. "Roddy, he actually has such influence? He's taking advantage of the situation. He has a keen sense of the current situation that us old guys can't compare to." Rubens tacitly agreed with Sally's word. "But now, his position is equally dangerous. The order has been issued. Although the trend has been set, I am not only worried about the influence of the undead among the nobles, but also the erosion of the church by these guys. So today, I came to ask you to write a letter to Angmar and secretly." Rubens said something in a low voice, and Sally's expression became slightly serious. After listening, she first looked around and asked in a low voice, "There are traitors in the church?" Rubens sighed slightly and said helplessly, "I would rather believe you and Roddy than some people in the church. This kind of thing is really a joke if it gets out." These were words from the bottom of his heart. He shook his head and then said solemnly, "Write the letter as soon as possible. From now on, focus on your cultivation. Don't mention this to a second person." Rubens whispered a few reminders, and Sally nodded in agreement. Then, this old man with a high position in the church quickly left. Looking at the old man's back, Sally could not help but worry about the guy who was still stirring up a storm on the other side of the kingdom. Chapter 230. Aaron Calendar, November 9th, 588. Unknowingly, the ownerless state of Gigtown had lasted for more than a week. Ever since Viscount Tranco was assassinated, the basic order in Gigtown did not collapse, but an inexplicable oppressive atmosphere made the civilians understand. Everything in front of them was just the calm before the storm. The weather was getting colder and colder, and many shops had already closed for business. In the cold wind, the pedestrians tried their best to shrink their bodies into their cloaks as they walked forward. When they passed the square in the middle of the town, they could vaguely see the notice about treason. The town that had lost its lord no longer had any patrols, and in its place were some suspicious outsiders. As for the intentions of these people, the people in the town were well aware of it, but they were helpless. In such a season, it was unrealistic to want to move elsewhere. The only thing they could do was to shut their doors tightly and pray for the war to end as soon as possible in front of the warm fireplace. Such scenes would eventually come to an end one day. At noon on the 9th, the sound of horse hooves from afar finally startled the quiet town. A cavalry team from the Western Territory rushed out of the forest. There were about 100 of them, and the leading knight was dressed in luxurious armor. The family emblem on his chest was a double-headed eagle. This indicated that he was Baron born of the Joyce family. The 100 cavalrymen were imposing, followed by a long line of supply teams and squires. There were about 230 people in total. After entering the town, Baron Bourne-Joyce first looked at the treason statement about Trenka in the square, and then stationed the troops at the edge of the town. He did not assume a posture of controlling the town completely. Speaking of which, this was a customary rule among the nobles. Humans were ultimately different from the orcs. If the Bloodhammer clan was here, perhaps Gig Town would have been slaughtered over and over again. But the principle pursued by the nobles was not to fight if possible. Even if there was a fight, they would not really be ruthless. Basically, they would mainly take the captives. After the battle was over and the ransom was paid, the captives could be taken back. To put it bluntly, profit was the most important thing among the nobles. When there was money to be made, it would be best if no one died. Under such rules, Baron Bourne leisurely waited outside the town. In the afternoon, the two feudal lords from the north also camped outside the town. Not only did the battle not break out, but the three feudal lords even sat at the same table for dinner. These nobles are so pretentious. They obviously want to smash each other's faces, but in the end, they still have to pretend to be gentlemen and chat casually. Tsk. It was still in the manner left by Ansadin. The atmosphere in the dining hall was obviously much better than the honey-tongued nobles' table a few kilometers away. Roddy, Sodeler, Ruger, Carter, and Akasha were all sitting here. At this time, the one who spoke was Roddy. But then he added, "Ahem, Sodeler, of course I'm not talking about you. You're so used to being a scout that you've forgotten that there's a baron among us, heh?" Only he dared to say such words casually. After all, in the traditional concept, scout and feudal lord were two completely different classes. Not to mention sitting together to eat, even speaking without using honorifics would be reprimanded. But such a custom naturally did not apply at the moment. Beside Roddy and the others' table, there were 7 or 8 other tables filled with scouts. These subordinates, cultivated by Roddy, had the qualifications to eat with them. Therefore, the atmosphere in the dining hall was very lively, quite like the harmonious atmosphere during training. I naturally have no objections. To be honest, being a baron like this is more interesting than I expected. Sodeler drank a cup of warm ale and said with a sigh, "When the Dukes of Angmar were bestowed the title, I was worried whether I would become like those nobles. Or if I'd cast away the bow after I've served my purpose, sending the brothers who fought side by side to a corner or something." Shaking his head, he looked around at the scouts who rushed over together and smiled. "It's good like this now. We're still together, and we can still charge side by side for the kingdom. I've long said that your worries are unnecessary." Roddy raised his cup and drank the warm water that Akasha specially poured for him. "Are the preparations for these days almost done?" "Almost as expected. Those Holy Temple soldiers are not good at fighting, but they're more than enough to be engineers." These words made Roddy roll his eyes, but he was naturally satisfied in his heart. He thought for a moment and stretched out his hand to count. 3 lords came today. According to the news, they'll almost all arrive in the next 2 days. The charm of Kyger Town is really not small. These guys are very cautious. Each of them is carefully watching the movements of the Dukes of Angmar. After hearing the news that Wellington and Titus went to the northwest fortress, they dared to openly appear. Sodeler pondered for a moment and whispered, "But what I'm worried about is, will they really take a long time before they make a move? The nobles are all like this. Let them talk slowly." Roddy rubbed the wooden cup in his hand. "According to the usual practice, they won't fight for at least half a month." Turning his head, Roddy asked something else. "Lu Gu, is there any news from the Silent Forest?" The scouts reported that there was a small accident, but everything is normal. The team will arrive tomorrow morning. "That's good. It's better to have more people." He looked at Akasha and reached out to pat her. "What are you thinking about recently? You're always distracted." I'm thinking about the contents of that book. The beautiful priestess was shocked by Roddy's action. She hurriedly whispered. Her voice was soft and weak, revealing an indescribable shyness. Roddy raised his eyebrows and smiled. I didn't expect you to be interested in these things. If I had known, I would have asked Natha to bring back more similar books for you to read. Akasha was a little embarrassed and said, Actually, what you said the other day seems to be feasible. Necromancy may be able to. Before she could finish speaking, the door of the dining hall was suddenly pushed open. The scout who was in charge of delivering the message trotted in with the cold air of early winter. He did not stop along the way and saluted Rhodey. After that, he reported a piece of shocking news. Chapter 231. The three lords outside Gigtown had different moods at this time. Since they were all here to fight for the territory of Gigtown, these lords would naturally be mentally prepared in their hearts. Sitting at the dinner table, they would not directly discuss the ownership of the territory, but constantly test each other's bottom line through words. As nobles, they all understood that no one could really monopolize this place. There were bandits, but there was no shortage of nobles. No matter who got the biggest share in the end, they would inevitably squeeze out a part of the benefits for the others. After all, they couldn't be too greedy. It would be best if they could come to an agreement with each other, but if they couldn't, then they would take a step back and show their strength. That was what the three lords were thinking, and that was how they chatted at the dining table. However, halfway through the meal, a sudden accident completely broke the peaceful situation. One of Baron Burns' knights had his head chopped off in his resting tent. Assassination was not uncommon, but it was still a dirty method that was reviled by people. So when such news came, Baron Bourne slammed the table and almost flipped the table. He stared at Howard and Pierce in front of him, trying to see something else from their expressions. However, after a long stalemate, the two lords only showed two emotions of astonishment and bewilderment. Why did this happen? Who can give me an explanation? Baron Bourne tried to restrain the anger in his tone, but he obviously couldn't get an answer. The three of them weren't partners to begin with. Now that something like this had happened, it was possible that they would start fighting without saying a word. However, the remaining two barons were still somewhat shrewd. They resisted the desire to explain, and each said that they would go back and investigate before talking, and hurriedly left. When Howard and Pierce returned to the camp, they were confused. They asked their deputy and butler for a long time, and finally could only confirm that this was not done by their men. But before they had time to explain anything, the knight's head was found in Baron Howard's camp. This strange fact was inexplicably leaked out before they could cover it up, causing Baron Bourne to immediately rush over with a team of knights. Such a confrontation was actually something that the three lords did not expect. But they did not fight in the end, because at this time, Earl Owen, who came from the Northern Territory, arrived outside the town with nearly 300 men. The appearance of the other three barons and their soldiers immediately congested the outskirts of Kyger town. The four puppet nobles arrived one after the other. They set up a station outside the town without interfering with each other. Each lord brought 30 to 90 knights. Including the remaining squires, there were more than 800 people in total. The sudden arrival of these nobles complicated the situation. Baron Bourne, who was still questioning Howard, had no choice but to stop. He knew very well that if a fight were to break out now, he would definitely be the one to suffer in the end. The four lords who came later had no intention of greeting him, and each of them put on a serious expression. At midnight, all the residences of the 7 feudal lords outside Geiger Town became quiet. But this was naturally a pretense. In the early hours of the morning, 4 figures in black robes met in a secret tent. Sodeler is in that manner. If anyone has our list, it can only be this guy. He's with Ongmar. I'm afraid that the list has already been handed over to Duke. He's just an old man who's about to die. After settling things here, our next target is Ongmar. The faces of Earl Owen and the other 3 barons were hidden under their hoods. Their low voices revealed an almost indifferent cruelty. Bourne, Howard, and Pierce, it's good to maintain the conflict between them to this extent. Let them suspect, but don't take action. Earl Durant will also arrive tomorrow. This guy has a lot of dealings with Sir Ansedin. They should be on the same boat, trust him? I can't do such a thing. Tomorrow, I'll do something to make Durant and them suspect each other. This way, it'll be convenient for us to act on our own. Lord Owen, are we, in the early hours of the morning, you and Marks go directly to that manor and take it down. Remember, leave no one alive. Earl Owen had obviously done a lot of research recently. He continued confidently, there are only 50 people in that manor at most. With your cavalry and infantry there are more than 200 people. You can surround them and kill them. The 2 barons who received the order looked at each other, and then bowed their heads respectfully. For Sir Ansedin. For Sir Ansedin. The low words echoed in the shadows. The puppets who intended to avenge Ansedin were very confident in their strength. Earl Owen had brought 90 fully armed knights and nearly 200 squires. Among them, 4 of the knights had advanced to level 5. Such a lineup could be considered powerful in the entire Iferta territory. The other 3 puppet barons were not weak either, so they were determined to avenge Ansedin. The first word they could think of for that unknown baron was encirclement and annihilation. Such a battle wasn't difficult at all. Even with the military strength of 2 lords, it was enough to completely crush Sodeler, who had an estimated military strength of around 50 people. This thought was completely because, subconsciously, the person who could kill Lord Ansedin was definitely not this kind of character. It must be the 2 Grand Knights, Wellington and Titus, who did it. The others were not a match for Sir Ansedin at all. In fact, they had guessed correctly, Ansedin had indeed died under Wellington's sword, but they had forgotten one detail. None of the lords had any information on Magda the Blightcaller, so they had no idea how intense the battle was before this. So at dawn, 60 knights on war horses led more than 140 squires and quietly surrounded the manor. They thought that they were undetected, but in fact, the sound of horses and soldiers moving was very obvious in the silent night. But when everyone came to the front of the manor, there was still no movement inside the manor. The manor was not big. In the dim dawn, the outline of the manor was faintly discernible. The candlestick in the master bedroom was still lit, and orange light shone through the window. Shadows could be vaguely seen moving in front of the window, as if they had discovered something. Someone opened the window to take a look, and then closed it as if nothing had happened. Surround this place. In the middle, leave a path for the knights to charge. What an idiot! They don't even know that death is at hand. The baron who was riding at the front of the team laughed in disdain. He then raised his hand and drew his longsword. Finish this quickly, don't leave anyone alive. Chapter 232. In the era that Earthbreaker lived in, the concept of urban warfare didn't exist in people's minds. Whether it was a castle, a fortress, or even a manor, no matter how the battle was fought, once the gate was breached, it would be a declaration of victory. The destruction of the defensive line would cause the morale of the defending troops to plummet, and the subsequent battle would basically be a one-sided massacre. With this thought in mind, when the iron gate of the manor collapsed, the soldiers who were charging at the front line immediately felt excited. According to common sense, there was no suspense in this battle. There was some movement in the manor, but it was quickly drowned out by the galloping of the cavalry behind them. The candlelight in the master bedroom on the second floor flickered a few times, and a figure flashed past. Seeing this scene, the 2 barons on horseback couldn't help but smile and squint their eyes. They promised rewards to the soldiers at the front. 1 head for 3 silver coins, and the one who kills Sodeler will be rewarded with 1 gold coin. The soldiers' hasty footsteps instantly sped up, and the excitement and fanaticism in their eyes couldn't be concealed. Although they were called soldiers, they were actually able-bodied farmers in the village. Their desire for battle basically stemmed from their yearning for money, so when they heard words like gold coins and silver coins, they immediately charged forward with all their might. The gate of the manor was right in front of them, and the soldiers at the front gripped their weapons tightly, ready to smash open the solid wood gate. But when they were about 7 or 8 meters away, the gate suddenly opened. The soldiers at the front were stunned. As there were no lit candles in the dark hall of the manor, it was completely dark, and they couldn't see what was inside. However, they could clearly hear the echoes of the warhorses' hooves hitting the floor as they galloped. "They have horses. It's cavalry. Be careful." By the time they reacted, it was already too late. With a resounding "Hiya!" with Sodeler in the lead, 5 knights on warhorses charged out of the mansion, directly crashing into the frontmost row of soldiers. These knights wore light armor, and apart from Sodeler, who wielded a heavy sword, the other 4 wielded heavy weapons: two-handed axes, chain hammers, and spiked clubs. These weapons that ordinary people couldn't easily wield immediately displayed their terrifying might in a close-range charge. The sound of watermelons being smashed rang out. Amidst the splattering of blood, the 5 knights practically stepped on the corpses of the first row of soldiers and leaped forward. The soldiers who had just rushed into the manor were not vigilant at all, so their formation was completely scattered. At this moment, when they were suddenly attacked, they only felt that 5 pitch-black mountains were rushing towards them. When they raised their heads to face the enemy, their originally high morale was instantly suppressed to the point that it disappeared without a trace. Sodeler was 1.9 meters tall, and the scouts that followed him were all over 1.8 meters tall. Right now they were just charging forward on their horses, and it was enough to make one feel despair. It's impossible to face them. What was even more frightening was that Sodeler and the others definitely weren't just for show. They swung their weapons mercilessly and sent the second echelon of infantry flying. Although there were only 5 of them, when the warhorses advanced, they were like a scythe that ignored the infantry's obstruction. In front of true professional soldiers, these soldiers could only be called farmers and couldn't even last 1 round. The infantry were dumbfounded. The people in front stopped and tried to dodge, while the people at the back were squeezed together because of the narrow entrance to the manor. This left some soldiers unable to retreat or dodge, and in the end, they could only throw away their weapons and run for their lives to the side. As a result, the infantry's previously high morale completely collapsed. "Charge out!" Sodeler's order was calm and steady, in stark contrast to the soldiers who had already begun to scatter. The 5 armored light cavalry easily charged out of the manor and flattened the defensive line formed by more than 20 infantry soldiers. It almost gave the illusion that they had forcefully pushed back the soldiers who had rushed into the manor. The 2 barons at the back were completely frightened by this scene. It felt as though some kind of ferocious beast had been released from the manor. There were several soldiers who tried to attack the knights, but when the huge chain hammers came over, their bodies were directly smashed into pieces with muffled sounds. Their chests were smashed and their skulls exploded. The terrifying might of heavy weapons was vividly displayed in such a battle. "I'm Baron Sodeler, shameless ambushers. You'll pay for this." Sodeler, who was charging at the front, roared at the soldiers in the hell-like bloody scene. Then, he didn't linger and turned to run towards the back of the manor, as though a wise man knew better than to fight when the odds were against him. Such an outcome made the faces of the 2 barons instantly turn ugly. They wanted to give chase, but when they saw the smashed corpses, they could only grip the reins tightly and shout to the side in exasperation, "Go, go, go, go! Chase after them and chop them to death. There are only 5 of them. Are we going to let them escape?" More than 60 knights immediately responded and rushed into the manor. However, they ran fast, but the soldiers in front of them were slow. There was not enough space in the manor for the knights to go around, so many infantrymen couldn't dodge in time and were sent flying by their own people. The scene instantly became chaotic. This was not the scene that the two barons had expected. When they saw that there were only 5 people on the other side, they were secretly delighted. However, in the blink of an eye, the other side had left, and their soldiers were huddled together like trash. This kind of disparity was really unacceptable. Damn it, get out of the way. Surround them from the left and right. Do you think they can run away from the manor? Although they shouted this, there were only a few who could hear them in the chaotic battlefield. This was how the feudal lords fought in this era. It was difficult to transmit the commander's orders to the battlefield. On one side were a group of militia, who had not gone through systematic training, and on the other side were a group of pampered knights. It was indeed difficult for them to suddenly face such a battlefield. Fortunately, the cavalrymen were fast enough. After breaking free from their entanglement, they immediately sped up, bypassing the manor and passing through the abandoned backyard. These cavalrymen who had finally displayed their advantages thought that they would see the 5 cavalrymen who were forced into a corner. However, when they turned around, they only saw the backs of the 5 cavalrymen who were sprinting towards the distant forest. When they looked closer, they discovered that a part of the manor's wall had been torn apart. The 2 barons who followed closely behind had extremely ugly expressions. 60 knights and more than 100 infantrymen actually let 5 people escape so easily? Chase. I want to see Sodeler's head in an hour. Amidst angry rebukes, more than 60 knights rumbled and chased after the 5 shadows in the distance. At this time, the soldiers who were left behind also reported a piece of news. There's nothing in the underground tomb. There's no one in the manor. Lord Baron, it's empty. I know it's empty. Then what are you waiting for? Let's go after them together. Roars sounded in the manor's back garden. Then, the 2 barons looked at each other and raised their horsewhips at the same time. The opportunity to avenge Ansadin was right in front of them, and they couldn't miss it no matter what. A bunch of retards. In the forest 2 kilometers away from the manor, Roddy stood on top of a temporarily built sentry tower and looked at the knights who were chasing after them like a swarm of bees. With a pine needle in his mouth, although Roddy's tone was more joking, his expression was not relaxed at this time. After sensing that there was a problem in the negotiations between the nobles, he immediately led most of the soldiers to retreat to the defensive line that he had started to repair a week ago. Speaking of which, this defensive line with a large number of fortifications was originally used to deal with this group of traitors, but its activation time was brought forward because of the enemy's attack. This was an unplanned situation. According to the original agreement, Roddy only needed to trap these nobles in Geiger Town until the 12th. However, this targeted attack on the morning of the 10th still made Roddy feel a little uneasy. If he couldn't hold on until the 12th, then it would be a mess. But this thought flashed past in a flash. Looking at the messy chasing knights in the distance, Roddy quickly suppressed these unreliable thoughts. What a joke! If I can't even beat this group of people, what's the point of my plan? After calculating the time of Sodeler's advance, Roddy turned around and made a "prepare for battle" gesture to Ruger. He turned his gaze to the other side. Akasha, who was squatting behind a tree, happened to look over. When their eyes met, Roddy nodded indifferently and then went to tidy up the quiver on his back. Akasha blinked, pursed her lips slightly, and looked away. Her expression didn't seem to change, but her hands under her sleeves were slightly clenched, and her palms unconsciously became a little moist. She couldn't tell if it was nervousness or some other emotion. She looked down at the ring on her finger and whispered to herself, "Remember what he said, don't be a burden." The soldiers in the defensive line were already prepared, but to outsiders, this place was completely empty. Whether it was the scouts or the temple guards, they all followed orders and hid under the fallen leaves, not moving at all. Time passed. The sound of hooves gradually grew louder. When the first ray of sunlight illuminated the top of the forest, Sodeler and the others just happened to rush into this dense forest. Chapter 233. Strictly speaking, these 60 people were all knights, in the traditional sense of the kingdom. They were ennobled as barons, had fiefs, and managed small villages. They usually paid taxes to the lord, and when there was a battle, they had to go into battle with their squires and conscripted militias. This was the system and concept that all human kingdoms used, and it was also one of the most profound imprints of the current era. But were such knights really powerful? Although there were strong people like Wellington and Titus, who were the best in EFTA, from the overall analysis, when the knights participated in actual combat, everything became a different matter. The knights might study martial arts on a daily basis, but most of them just wanted to get a better ranking in the competition. Most knights would be very arrogant because they knew some swordsmanship and had a set of armor that had been passed down for several generations. Although they didn't look down on each other, when they really gathered together, there was absolutely no tacit understanding. Formation? Coordination? Everyone rushed in their own direction, finding the enemy and killing them. Who would care if the person next to them had a tacit understanding with them? This was the true portrayal of the 60 knights. Their individual strength might be good, and when they charged forward bravely, each knight using their full strength. But similarly, they didn't have the slightest misgivings about the coordination between themselves and the other knights. After charging for 2 kilometers, the knights who were still gathered together had completely dispersed. And because they had charged too fiercely, the squires had long been left behind and disappeared. If they were old knights who had experienced war in earlier years, perhaps they would understand the principle of infantry and cavalry fighting together. But these young knights clearly didn't think that they would encounter failure. When they rushed into the forest, they immediately saw Sodeler and the others who had greatly slowed down. They immediately prepared to surround and kill them. In the dense forest, the knights couldn't maintain high speed, so at this time, their advantage in numbers was immediately apparent. And what made them even more excited was that Sodeler and the others in front of them actually stopped after running for a while. The first batch of more than 20 knights who entered the forest grinned, as if they could already see the scene of the enemies being surrounded and killed. But soon, their expressions froze on their faces. "Archers! Get out of the way!" When he raised his head, a large group of figures holding short bows had unknowingly appeared in the forest in front of him. Simple archers might not have been able to surprise them, but the key point was that these archers weren't standing on the ground, but on the sentry towers that had artificial traces around them. 5 to 6 meters above the ground caused the knights to reveal expressions of despair. There were not many knights in the Callan kingdom who had mastered the unorthodox skill of mounted archery. Therefore, none of them carried any long-range weapons. Under such circumstances, even a fool would understand the consequences of continuing to charge forward. The knights immediately turned around and were ready to escape. However, the arrows were already aimed at them. The command of "Fire!" sounded, and as the arrows were shot, the screams and the muffled sounds of horses falling off their horses resounded through the forest. The knights on the horses were in a complete panic. Arrows whizzed past their ears, but they did not even know where to hide. The archers who occupied the high ground had almost no blind spots. 3 waves of fatal arrows were shot in a row, directly injuring the 10 knights in the front row. Boom! Some of the knights still wanted to fight to the death to attack Sodeler, but before they could charge far, they were sent flying in a ball of fire. The appearance of the explosive arrows made these knights even more disheartened. The knights who were attacked in the front row struggled for a long time, but finally began to scatter to the sides. As their horses galloped, the power of the arrows was immediately reduced. The knights who followed behind also relied on their own combat awareness to avoid the most concentrated area of the arrows. Although they were in a sorry state, they still managed to escape from the fatal threat. But in this way, the remaining 40 or so knights were completely scattered in the forest. They tried to turn their horses around and run back, but just as they were about to leave the forest, Sodeler led an entire team of 20 scouts to sweep the area. It sounded like 47 knights against a team of 21 scouts, but in reality, it was the complete opposite. The knights who were scattered by the rain of arrows were basically in groups of 3 to 5, with the most being no more than 8. Meanwhile, the team of 21 scouts was a single unit. This immediately gave Sodeler's team an absolute advantage in a certain area. Not only was my warhorse better than yours, but my equipment was also better than yours. My people were stronger than yours. Even in terms of numbers, I still had a crushing advantage. Sodeler and his team were unstoppable. Due to the restrictions of the forest, the scouts had to use scimitars and longswords as their weapons. At this moment they were like cats chasing mice. No matter how the scattered knights tried to resist, they were all killed in an instant. Of the 60 knights, more than 30 were killed within 7 or 8 minutes of entering the forest. The rest were completely scared out of their wits, and only wanted to run out of the forest. But when they finally left the forest, what they saw was a scene of 2 barons and more than 130 soldiers swarming towards them. One side advanced while the other retreated. Both sides collided once again. At this time, the knights' morale had completely collapsed. Although there were still more than 20 of them, in fact, none of them wanted to continue fighting. They fled pathetically like stray dogs being chased around. Seeing their subordinates in such a state, the 2 barons were dumbfounded. "What's going on?" None of the knights stopped to respond. They frantically fled into the distance as though they had seen a ghost, leaving the 2 barons looking at each other in dismay. But this question was quickly answered. Sodeler and his team rushed out of the forest and stopped at the edge of the woodland. No wonder there was a problem. Turns out they had helpers. One of the barons said this, but he wasn't afraid at all. He looked at the more than 130 soldiers around him, and then at the 20 cavalrymen in front of him. He was still sure that he had the upper hand. After giving the other baron a look, he waved his hand and gave the order to attack again without hesitation. "Charge! Kill them all!" As soon as he said that, the troops in front of him suddenly changed. The sound of hooves came from the forest. Then, figures gradually appeared at the back of the original team of 21. The other 20 scouts who were in reserve had all joined the troop. Not only were they here to replenish the ranks, but they were also carrying long lances in their hands. After entering the ranks, they immediately stood at the front with their 3-meter-long lances pointing towards the sky. Their entire body of metal armor and the sharp tip of their lances glimmered coldly under the first rays of the morning sun. When the entire group stood still in silence, they looked like a steel beast that was about to devour its prey. 100 meters away, the scattered soldiers were about to brace themselves and charge forward after running for 2 kilometers. But after seeing the scene in front of them, their footsteps immediately became hesitant. "Cavalry regiment charge!" Sodeler's order was abnormally clear in the silent troops. His warhorse began to slowly accelerate, and he suddenly swung his sword forward. In the next moment, as though the mountains were collapsing and the earth was splitting, the entire cavalry regiment actually began to accelerate at full speed at almost the same time. From stillness to attack, their posture was like an unsheathed sword, and they launched a charge towards the enemy in the most unyielding manner. After leaving the forest area, the warhorse's acceleration was no longer hindered. This cavalry regiment that had experienced countless battles at this time with absolute military quality made the 2 barons in the distance, who did not know how to fight at all, feel cold from the bottom of their hearts. The distance of 100 meters seemed to be covered in a single leap. Under the half-moon formation, the momentum of the charge instantly collapsed the morale of the militias, who couldn't even hold their shields firmly. But at this time, it was already useless to turn around and escape. Bang, bang. In just an instant, the forest of lances pierced through the frail formation and split it apart. More than 100 soldiers did not have the physical qualities to stop the warhorses, nor did they have a reliable formation to rely on. Standing in the open, they were like lambs waiting to be slaughtered. In the blink of an eye, they were completely crushed by the cavalry. The two barons on horseback were frightened by the scene in front of them. Seeing the terrifying troops coming towards them, they immediately disregarded their dignity and turned to run. But before their horses could accelerate, two ghostly arrows pierced through their bodies on the spot. When Roddy's figure appeared in the chaotic battlefield, he didn't attract any attention at all. But his existence was definitely more terrifying than Sodeler's troop. But what happened next made Roddy frown slightly. The two barons had been shot in the chest and abdomen. If they were ordinary people, they would have lost all ability to move and would definitely fall off their horses. But at this time, the two barons continued to move their horses without any hindrance. It was as if the arrows in their bodies didn't cause much damage to them. "Damn puppets!" Roddy cursed in a low voice and then raised his hand to shoot two arrows. The explosive arrow exploded behind the two barons. The puppets weren't completely undead like Magda. At this time, they couldn't withstand such an attack and were blasted off their horses. Chapter 234. The warm sunlight shone through the gap of the curtains into the room. The white-haired Dukes of Angmar turned his head and put down the parchment in his hand. He stood up and opened the curtains. Then, he reached out and pushed the window open. The cold air poured into the room, and the warmth created by the fireplace was expelled in an instant. Old Duke frowned slightly. The cold made his mind clearer, but the message he received in the early hours of the morning made him unable to calm down. After taking a few breaths, Angmar started coughing. His maid, Julie, hurried over to cover him with a cloak and whispered to him to leave the window. "I'm old. Tightening the cloak on his shoulders, Angmar waved his hand, but his eyes were looking at the north wall of Hullier. Under the light of dawn, he could vaguely see a group of people leaving the city. "I hope we can make it in time," he sighed. Then, a servant rushed over and asked in a low voice, "Bishop Benjamin is downstairs, asking to see Master." As if he had expected this, Angmar replied in a low voice, "Let him come up and talk." Not long after, Benjamin, who was dressed in a bishop's robe, came in front of Angmar. The bishop did not say anything but bowed deeply in apology. He said in shame, "There is a traitor in the church. I really can't do anything. Apologizing now won't help him." Angmar held him up. He did not have the intention to turn against him. He wanted to say something, but he coughed instead. Benjamin raised his hand and wanted to use the holy light magic to heal him, but was stopped by Old Duke. With cough, the bad habit from the war, using too much divine art is not good. "I cough. I know this." Having said that, Benjamin naturally would not continue to cast spells. After a moment of silence, he continued, "I tried my best to block the news, but in the end I still found out that someone leaked it. There was no other way. I could only send the team on their way as soon as possible. Hopefully we can make it in time. Plans can't keep up with changes. There's no point in blaming ourselves." Although he said that, Angmar's face was still gloomy. Although he did not say anything offensive, it was obvious that he was really angry. "Roddy stood in front of all of us old men. A few days ago, he even killed the blighters and the mastermind behind it. Such a great merit, and we gave him this kind of help? I know it's not your fault, but it can't be justified. It really can't be justified. I'm already old, yet I still have to rely on such a junior to stand up for me. I'm ashamed." Although the words were light, they were heavy. Benjamin's old face flushed red. He was so ashamed that he could not even lift his head. Although he had expected such an outcome when he came to apologize, he was already an old man. Saying such words was not something that could wash away his pride. I'll try my best. If this matter can pass, then let it pass. If it can't, Angmar shook his head and sighed. He did not say anything more. He just looked down and said, "Go back and make arrangements. No matter what, it's time to clean up EFTA." Benjamin seemed to be finally relieved. He bowed his head and apologized again, then left silently. After he left, Angmar coughed violently again. This time, he coughed for a long time and more violently. Maid Julie hurriedly came over with warm water and patted Duke's back. When Angmar raised his head, his originally pale face was very red because of blood congestion. It took a long time for him to recover. Julie wanted to call Bishop Benjamin, who had just left, back, but Enkema waved her off. He endured the pain in his chest, came to the desk, picked up a quill, and continued to write the letter. "There's actually a traitor. How shameful! Asterisk, 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 asterisk." At the same time, Earl Owen faced the cold wind blowing from the forest with a sneer at the corner of his mouth. No wonder he's been holding back. It turns out that he's waiting for number 12 to make his move. The letter in his hand had just arrived this morning. The source was naturally the Rose Cross Monastery in Hollier City. No matter how confidential the news was, no matter how sealed it was, it could not stop a traitor, and because of the existence of this traitor, Roddy's plan to catch all the traitors in EFTA territory in one fell swoop had completely lost its effectiveness. Although his layers of plans were meticulous, they could only be called a conspiracy. But once the conspiracy was known by the opponent, all his advantages would collapse in an instant. Baron Sodeler, 60 knights and 20 infantrymen under him? This ratio of troops is really ridiculous. There's even someone called Roddy? I've never heard of such a person. Recalling the contents of the letter, Earl Owen was actually quite disapproving. An army of less than 100 people. In front of him, it was just a group of weak scum that he could crush at any time. Originally, he thought he could avenge Lord Ansedin with his own hands, but now it seemed that the 2 barons he had sent in advance were enough to solve all this. He looked up at the sun, guessing the fate of this Baron Sodeler. Perhaps it would not be long before his head was brought to him, right? However, before this thought disappeared, a few figures on horses running frantically appeared in his field of vision. When they approached, Owen found that these people in front of him looked a little familiar. "Help! Help! Lord Owen, we need support." A few minutes later, Earl Owen's eyes widened as he listened to the knight's story. He even suspected that he was hallucinating. 60 knights and more than 130 infantrymen, and only a few of them came back after an encounter? Earl Owen was not stupid. He immediately asked about the battle in detail. After analyzing the words of these knights, he frowned deeply. Sodeler actually built a line of defense in the forest. Such a thing gave Duke Owen a headache. He knew very well that if he rushed up with his troops, he would probably end up no better than the 2 barons who had already died. "Pass down my order. Immediately increase the scope of the patrol around Geiger Town. Report any unusual movements immediately. If you see any unidentifiable team, be on your guard. Increase the scope of surveillance and gradually squeeze out Sodeler's range of action." From a military point of view, Earl Owen was clearly well versed in the art of war. His approach was extremely correct, because according to the spy's information, the Rose Cross team that was trying to destroy him would need another 2 days to arrive here. Before that, he could monitor all the surrounding areas and look for opportunities to destroy them one by one. With the initiative to grasp the information, Earl Owen immediately stood in the position of active manipulation. However, this reversal of the situation was not over. Not long after the reconnaissance order was carried out, a message came back from the forest, which made the Earl's lips curl into a sinister smile. His scouts had discovered an unfamiliar team heading in Sodeler's direction. When it was close to noon, the battlefield outside the forest was basically quiet. The strong smell of blood filled the air, But after a long time, it was no longer as disgusting as it was at first. Inside the line of defense in the forest, the resting soldiers had just had a simple lunch and were resting at this time. Akasha, on the other hand, walked among the soldiers and kept casting recovery spells on the injured scouts. "Thank you, Priest Akasha. You're welcome." Swords had no eyes, and injuries were inevitable. The soldiers were not machines. They had a fear of death and felt pain when they were stabbed. This was something they had to experience. However, Akasha's existence greatly alleviated their pain. Therefore, they all respected this beautiful priest from the bottom of their hearts and spoke very politely. Feeling the sincere greetings of these soldiers, Akasha felt an indescribable sense of satisfaction in her heart. In the past, studying divine spells was just pure research. Now that she saw that divine spells saved the soldiers, she naturally felt that she had done a good job. But when she returned to Roddy's side, Akasha was directly scolded. "Who told you to do this? The battle is far from over. Using up all your magic power is a big taboo. Don't do this without my order in the future, do you hear me?" After being scolded, Akasha was suddenly at a loss. She pursed her lips and wanted to refute, but in the end, she lowered her head and endured it. She mumbled, "I understand." She felt very wronged, and even tears welled up in her eyes. "It's good that you remember. Take it." In her field of vision, a blue crystal bottle was stuffed into her hand. Then, she heard Roddy's gentle voice. "The effect will be better if you take it slowly. At least, keep more than half of your magic power at all times. And, thank you." Akasha lowered her head and held the bottle of magic power potion tightly. Most of the grievances and dissatisfaction in her heart dissipated, but then she found that Roddy's face was a little gloomy. She summoned her courage and took the initiative to ask, Didn't we win? Is there something else? Hurry up and recover your magic power. You won't understand even if I tell you." Roddy had no intention of explaining and completely treated her like a child. This made Akasha very unconvinced, but when she saw Sodeler walking over with a solemn face, she gave up the idea of continuing to talk. She walked to a nearby place and sat down to meditate. But from afar, she could vaguely hear the conversation between the two. "According to the plan, Natha should be here. I just sent someone to investigate, but the report said that the number of spies outside the town has suddenly increased. It seems to be a little strange." Before they could finish their conversation, a guy covered in wounds ran over with the help of a scout. Akasha knew this person. His name was Buffon, one of the two mercenaries that Roddy had saved. Seeing Buffon's blood, Akasha instinctively got up and wanted to cast a divine spell. However, Buffon ignored the pain and said something that shocked everyone with a trembling voice. "Our team was besieged. The village chief of Aisha village is also in the team. He and Miss Natha are all surrounded by the team that suddenly appeared. It's useless for the Holy Knights to report their identities. There are hundreds of them. We can't beat them at all. Henry asked me to run here to report. They helped me stall the pursuers." Chapter 235. Accident. It was definitely an accident. Roddy stood there motionless for 3 to 4 seconds. He had countless scenarios of how the battle would turn out, but he never expected that it would turn out like this. All the plans had been deduced and hypothesized in detail. Even the return route of Natha's team had been strictly verified and calculated. Is it a coincidence? Sodeler's voice seemed to come from far away, but it also sounded like he was mumbling to himself. Roddy did not answer. He remained in a daze. The people around him quietened down. Even Akasha, who was silently casting the recovery spell, raised her head and carefully held her breath. They knew that Roddy's next order might directly determine everyone's fate. It's not a coincidence. There are no coincidences. Roddy's eyes lost focus for a long time. When he came back to his senses, His fingers trembled as he took out a letter from Hollier City from 4 days ago. The handwriting of the Dukes of Angmar was still vivid in his mind. He hastily scanned through it and seemed to confirm a certain possibility. But it was useless to confirm the reason now. What Roddy needed to consider was the choice he had to make at the moment. To save Natha and the others now, or to wait for the reinforcements to arrive. 20 paladins, mercenary Henry, wood elf Natha, and Brody who had come here for unknown reasons. If he chose to save them now, they might have a chance to survive. But at the same time, this meant that he might have to face a large number of enemies, or this was a trap set by the enemy, waiting for him to jump into it. If he chose to continue with the original plan, Roddy could pretend that he did not hear Buffon's words and completely give up on Natha and the others. He would wait until he had an absolute advantage before taking action. The two paths in front of him led to two extremes. Roddy suddenly remembered a sentence written in a book: "The king of the battlefield is a cold-blooded butcher." He also remembered some of the thoughts he had when he played the game. Back then, Roddy had a strong desire to win, so he only regarded the army in the war as chess pieces. When it was time to die, let the chess pieces die and use them in exchange for victory. It was completely justified. But what if everything became a reality? Fantasizing was, after all, just a few keystrokes on the keyboard. However, when all the burdens were on him, Roddy realized that he could not make such a choice. Sacrificing them in exchange for the death of a group of traitors? Roddy shook his head and slowly exhaled. The surrounding soldiers had already quietened down. Buffon had already woken up under the treatment and was answering various questions from the weak Sodeler. "They have a lot of people, more than 200 people. They are blocking us in the forest." Listening to these words, Roddy's mind slowly replayed the scene of him wielding a short bow and approaching Magdalene. Was a lower level a disadvantage? Was having fewer people definitely a disadvantage? In the next moment, Roddy's command rang out in the forest. Level 1 combat readiness. Depart in 3 minutes. Let's go light. Akasha suddenly raised her head because she sensed an unprecedented aura coming from Roddy. However, Sodeler and the scouts all remembered the last time they saw Roddy in this state. It was on the Nehemia Plains, after they were ambushed by Sirota. That time, Roddy silently and resolutely led the counterattack, luring the enemy deep into the death swamp, and killing all the enemies. "I have a rough plan. Bring the map over. Captain, come over and listen to my orders." Roddy slowly got up, the calmness of the past completely gone. His entire person was like a cold machine as he began to methodically issue orders. "Go and take out all the commonly used potions. Drink what you need to drink now." Roddy's command echoed in the forest, and the soldiers quickly carried it out. The 20 Holy Temple soldiers who joined later also joined the team. They held the sky-high, stone-skin potion in their hands and looked at each other in dismay. In order to save a small team of 20 people who were trapped in the enemy's formation, everyone took potions worth more than 100 gold coins. Such a thing was simply unheard of. But what followed was an inexplicable feeling in their hearts. Such a leader they wholeheartedly accepted. When Akasha got up, Roddy's command also came. "Bring all the scrolls and potions and follow the team on horseback." Yes. Akasha's voice was always a little timid in the past, but now it was incomparably clear. But Roddy was not interested in this at all. He reached out and took the map from Sodeler, who had just woken up, and dragged the awakened Buffon up. He started a pre-war meeting with Ruger and the others. "Go through this street, we cannot stop. I have a way to ensure that the enemy for a period of time. The retreat route is here. No one stop, I will cover the rear. This is a military order." Sodeler stared at the map for a long time, and only asked one question. "Why do we have to run south? That's closer to Hollier City." Roddy answered the question expressionlessly. After stuffing Angmar's letter into his pocket, he glanced at the basic level, EXP that was originally reserved for basic level. He raised his hand and pressed the level up button next to the word Witcher. A notification immediately appeared in the battle log bar. Leveled up to Witcher level 3. Obtain new skill, rapid shooting level, 1 consumption, 50 MP use, basic attack speed increased by 5% for 30 seconds. After the skill is activated, every arrow that hits the target will increase attack speed by 2%. This effect can be stacked up to 10 times. Cooldown: 2 minutes. New skill, Link's Nimble, passive, jump speed increased by 30%, movement speed increased by 10% in obstructed terrain. After a brief look at the skill information, Roddy filled the quiver with 24 arrows, and hung 2 additional quivers and a bulging bag on the saddle. When he turned over and got on the horse, all the soldiers around him were completely ready. Roddy still had that cold expression. Before getting up and getting on the horse, he pressed Buffon, who wanted to follow him, back. "I want revenge. Henry is over there." Buffon tried to get up, but Roddy shook his head and let him sit back down with a blank expression. Roddy stared into the distance and said, as if he was talking to himself, "To be honest, I'm a person who holds grudges. After they offend me, the matter of revenge will be done by me." A few kilometers away, all the lords who came to Gigtown were collectively questioning Earl Owen's actions. Gigtown wasn't that big, and with the 7 lords surrounding it, everyone could see the slightest movement. Under such circumstances, the 2 battles that happened in the early morning naturally couldn't escape the eyes of the ubiquitous spies. "I don't know what Earl Owen's intention is. Is he showing off his power to us? If you have to use force, I, Howard, will naturally accompany you to the end." "Earl Owen, that team doesn't seem to have a grudge against you, right?" When the questions came down, Earl Owen, who was wearing gorgeous armor, still looked calm. When they were almost done, he replied with a smile, "You don't have to be so nervous. I caught this team because they attacked my supply convoy." After saying such words, regardless of whether it was true or not, it was still a reasonable reason. Attacked the convoy? What's going on? The one who spoke was Earl Durante, who had just arrived this morning. His eyes were filled with anger. Half of the reason was that there was no news of the assassin Sean, and the other half was that his butler was actually killed in the tent last night. This made him and Viscount Howard feel the same anger in their hearts, and they unconsciously became suspicious of all the lords around them. Owen smiled with a hint of playfulness and explained, "I don't know the specific reason yet, but obviously the guy behind this team is trying to make some trouble for me." "Whose people?" "It's a baron named Sodeler. I wonder, has anyone heard of him?" "He's just an upstart who has just been conferred the title of baron. He's just a small fry. Don't bother with him." This was a common understanding. Earl Owen shrugged helplessly. "So, I don't know how I provoked him. I'm actually being dealt with by such a cheap trick. Ha!" The more he said so, the more the other lords pricked up their ears to listen. Earl Owen was very good at playing hard to get, and he quickly shifted his hatred. The suspicion between the lords was already lacking a target to vent on. At this time, the appearance of the name, Sodeler, almost immediately became the target of suspicion. Although no one said it explicitly, it was obvious that they all secretly remembered the name in their hearts. ***********. The atmosphere outside Kygertown was tense, but the inside barely maintained the normal operation of order. There were still a few shops open for business on the street, but their business was naturally very mediocre. Occasionally, there would be figures in cloaks going in and out, but they would leave very quickly, for fear of provoking those knights who were running amok in the town. However, under such circumstances, there was always a dwarf standing at the door of a leather shop, looking around. For several days in a row, he stood there from morning to night, as if waiting for someone. This guy was Master Suluan, who had promised to give Roddy the hardened armor plate. More than a week ago, Roddy, who had the fire-thorn iguana skin, paid Suluan with a pot of wine as a reward. But when the agreed time came, Roddy did not have time to come here to collect it because of the various attacks of these lords. Roddy did not feel anything, because now even if he took the armor plate, there was no way to immediately make it into a leather armor to wear. But this kind of failure to keep the promise made Master Suluan feel extremely uncomfortable. He was addicted to wine, and it could even be said that he had reached the point of addiction. Since drinking the bag of wine that Roddy brought over, Suluan had completely fallen for it, because that bag of wine was not enough at all. Why hasn't he come yet? Why hasn't he come yet? Chapter 236. Serene, the leather maker, was not crazy. He just had a weird habit of drinking. He might be a little mean, but he was a normal person with a good heart. However, when a large group of soldiers appeared on the street, his behavior was a little strange. In such an era, the law was usually not used to protect the people. After the death of Lord Tranka, Gig Town was in a state of chaos. Basically, no one would be held accountable for any crime. This meant that all the soldiers in front of him could turn into thugs at any time. When the coat of arms representing Earl Owen appeared in his field of vision, Suren's expression suddenly became extremely hostile. However, in the face of more than 200 fully armed soldiers, he did not do anything stupid. He just cursed in a low voice and took a few steps back. These soldiers were not interested in him. If one paid a little attention, one could see that they were escorting a group of prisoners of war in the middle. 20 armored Templars had their hands tied tightly with rope. The marks on their bodies showed that they were captured alive after a hard fight. Some of the knights had bloodstains on their armors, and their faces were full of bruises. Obviously, they had suffered a lot of beatings after being controlled. As a leather maker, Serene was also very familiar with armor. However, when he gritted his teeth and was about to return to the shop, he was surprised to find that these prisoners of war were wearing the Rose Cross standard armor. The Templars actually had a conflict with Earl Owen? Is he crazy? When such a thought came to his mind, Serene could not help but stop there. All the shops around had long been closed, so Serene's lonely figure was quickly noticed by these knights. What are you looking at? Do you want to die? Your town will soon belong to Earl Owen. Hurry up and enjoy your last moments. Not all knights were moral models who pursued the 8 cardinal virtues in the chivalry system. In fact, a large number of knights were basically no different from robbers. The mocking laughter made Serene's unusually gloomy face turn red. He opened his mouth, but in the end, the master leather maker could not say anything. What happened in the past made him very clear that in this kind of situation, even if he was beaten to death, no one would come out to say anything. The world was cruel. Without the protection of an overlord, these knights could do anything they wanted without any scruples. Sullen and angry, Serene gritted his teeth so hard that they almost broke. But in the end, he suppressed his anger and returned to his shop. Fortunately, the knights were busy sending the captives to the other side of the town. Otherwise, he might not even be able to keep his shop. Suluan locked the door and kicked the cabinet beside him. Not only did he vent his anger, but the pain in his toes also made him realize that there was nothing he could do. The only thing he could do was to sit on the chair and pull his hair with all his might. These bastards, scum, asterisk 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 among the captives, the paladin, Natha, and the others were pushed forward. There was almost no suspense in the battle that took place in the forest. 24 people were surrounded by more than 200 people. It was a miracle that Buffon could escape. Although Natha's arrows were sharp, the paladin, who could not take advantage of their mobility, could not fight against so many people. The whole team only lasted for 10 minutes before they were all captured. Fortunately, Earl Owen ordered them to be captured alive, so everyone, including Fatty Henry, was still alive. But they had suffered a lot of beatings. In the whole team, the ones who were the least injured and not taken care of were Natha and Brody, who were heavily guarded. Brody decided to find Roddy at the last minute because of Elson, but he did not expect to encounter such a thing. He was really unlucky. At this time, he was hunched over, looking like an old man with one foot in the grave. His hands were tied with ropes, but not tightly. There was a wound on his forehead, and he looked around at the surrounding buildings with an indifferent expression. However, he remained silent. In the battle just now, this old elf did not release any spells, so in the eyes of the others, he was just an old man without any fighting strength. Compared with Brody, Natha's beauty amazed the group of knights. But because she was Earl Owen's trophy, no one dared to have any extra thoughts about her. Natha's treatment was more special. She was too strong. In the battle just now, she killed 8 soldiers almost in the blink of an eye. When they finally caught her, they paid the price of serious injuries. So at this time, in order to prevent her from hurting people, the soldiers completely tied Natha's upper body with ropes and handcuffed her with heavy shackles before they dared to stand by her side. Natha's eyes were almost spewing fire as she struggled to walk. Hatred, resentment, negative emotions piled up in her chest, making it almost impossible for her to calm down. She hated humans, hated these abominable guys in front of her, and even hated Roddy. What was Roddy doing? When she killed the Blood Crow in Elsa Village, she still admired and appreciated Roddy a lot. But now, all this turned into loss and despair. There were 200 enemies, or even more, besieging her. This situation was completely hopeless. She could not think of a reason why Roddy would come here to rescue her. The despair in the bottom of her heart made Natha unable to think. She did not even think about why Brody surrendered, nor did she see the little gesture of the village chief silently bending his fingers as he walked. The team moved forward in silence. After passing through the wide commercial street, they headed for Earl Owen's camp in the northeast of the town. The 40 knights guarded on both sides of the team, and the remaining 100 soldiers were less than 50 meters away from each other. At this time, they were relaxed and only thinking about the reward that Earl Owen would give them. They were not worried about any accidents at all. But just before they walked out of Chigtown, some dust suddenly rose from the edge of the forest in the distance. What's that? It should be the new lord. He's making such a big scene. Is he afraid that others won't know that he's here? While chatting, the team escorting the prisoners of war still moved forward without vigilance. My intentions are clear to all of you. These captives are Baron Sodeler's subordinate. I've kept them alive as a sign of my sincerity. If he's willing to stand on the negotiating table with us, that's for the best. But if he still insists on doing things his own way— Earl Owen shrugged his shoulders and looked around at the lords in front of him. Then I'm sure you'd like to see what the lord who tried to occupy Geiger Town is capable of. Earl Owen, these things are just minor details. The ownership of Chigtown is only one aspect. Tranka has such a large territory. What about the taxes of those knights? The Dukes of Angmar may not agree. Angmar? Who cares whether he agrees or not now? Francis died inexplicably, and Sally went to the Holy Temple and won't come back for 2 years. Since you're here today, your eyes are naturally not only on Chigtown. The intention expressed in this sentence was already obvious. The biggest lord of Ifta's territory was no longer able to hold on, and the situation of collapse was imminent. The barons led by Howard hoped to get a piece of the pie as soon as possible, while the puppets led by Owen wanted to quickly get rid of Sodeler and avenge Ansedin. Earl Durant had both intentions, but because his power was too great, he was rejected by both sides at the same time. Thus, the situation had unknowingly reached a delicate balance. However, just when the negotiations were at an impasse, the smoke and dust raised in the distance made several lords turn their heads at the same time. Who's coming this time? Quite a bluff. Is it a warning to us? Ha ha. Amidst the cold laughter, The lords did not take this show seriously. Earl Owen turned his head to look, but there was a strange premonition in his heart. He muttered to himself, "Impossible. Earl Owen, what do you think? Do you know who's coming?" "I'm just thinking, if the person coming is Baron Sodeler." Earl Owen pointed to the distance and deliberately made a scared expression. "Is he going to directly fight with us? I'm so scared." Such words naturally caused a burst of undisguised laughter. At this time, there were more than 400 knights and more than 2,000 infantrymen among the 5 lords. This scale was enough to fight a war. Who would have the guts to rush over? Not to mention the Baron, who had less than 100 soldiers under his command. Although they were all fighting for power, these old nobles still showed a unanimous, disdainful attitude in the face of those who did not know the rules. At this moment, the soldiers in their respective camps were actually as relaxed as the nobles. In the face of the team rushing over from 500 meters away, they were not too vigilant. They just looked around curiously, and did not think of the word fight at all. 400 meters. The horses' hooves thundered, and the smoke and dust gradually dispersed. People could see that this was only a team of about 60 people. 300 meters. The armor of the people coming was clearly visible, and the outline of the lance pointing high into the sky could already be seen clearly. 200 meters. The war horses accelerated again, heading straight for Earl Owen's camp. 100 meters. Earl Owen's knights finally realized that the other side did not seem to be as simple as showing off. The raised lance was actually leveled at the camp. The camp was in chaos. The soldiers picked up their weapons randomly, and the knights didn't even have time to put on their armor. The soldier who passed the order shouted loudly, but he could only watch as the team rushed towards him at an extreme speed. The lords who were 200 or 300 meters away still maintained the posture of talking just now, but at this time, they were staring blankly at Earl Owen's camp. Everyone had an extremely interesting expression on their faces, but the corner of Earl Owen's mouth twitched 4 or 5 times in succession. Boom! There was a crash. Chapter 237. Crazy! Crazy! They are trampling on the rules. When the rumbling sounds came, the faces of the lords immediately changed. Earl Owen, whose camp had been attacked, turned around and left without saying a word. When he got on his horse, he did not forget to look back and say coldly, "Are you going to watch him break the rules?" The meaning of this sentence couldn't be more clear. The nobles never wanted to see such a rash and reckless person appear. So no matter what kind of conflict of interest these lords had before, Sodeler was now an enemy standing on the opposite side of them. It was impossible to judge the situation in the distance at this time. Although Earl Owen was burning with anxiety at this time, he could only rush back to the camp under the protection of the knights around him. He could roughly confirm that this crazy scene in front of him was done by Lord Sodeler, but the other party wanted to go against him with only 60 men. No matter how he looked at it, this was an act of overestimating one's own strength and courting death. With this thought in mind, he ordered the soldiers around him to speed up. He held the sword that had not been unsheathed for many years and narrowed his eyes slightly. The time for revenge has finally come. At the same time, Earl Owen's camp had fallen into complete chaos. When the cavalry regiment in the distance rushed over, there was no one at the front of the camp who dared to fight them head-on. The knights did not even have time to get on their horses, let alone prepare barricades and trenches. The camp was empty because they were escorting Natha and the others. At this time, there were less than 200 people in total, not even a single armed knight. There was no suspense in such a battle. When Sodeler and the others rushed into the camp, the whole front line was torn apart like a piece of cloth by a pair of scissors. The troops marched straight in without any resistance. "Stop them! Get on the horses! Get on the horses! Gather together!" Earl Owen's subordinates shouted in panic. A few knights hurriedly mounted their horses and wanted to resist, but after a few steps without any tacit understanding, they were greeted by a whole half-moon formation. The knights who were not equipped with armor were directly pierced into sieves by the pure suppression. After Sodeler and the others rushed into the camp, they scattered and attacked without hesitation. Even though this increased the range of their attacks, their momentum seemed to have declined after losing their formation. Soon, the knights caught up to them and a head-on battle broke out again. However, these knights soon discovered that they did not even have the ability to resist and were completely suppressed. The reason for this was simple. After the blessing of power, drinking the stone skin potion, and with the powerful holy priest Akasha following behind them, all the scouts' morale was at its peak. The enemy's resistance and attacks had no effect on them at all. The stone skin potion was equivalent to giving them a shield out of thin air. Even if they were to be slashed in the arm by a sword, it would only leave a shallow wound. The holy shield, that would flash on their bodies from time to time, was almost invincible on the chaotic battlefield. With such a strong logistical support and 2 bottles of intermediate healing potion in their pockets, they couldn't think of any reason to back down from such a comprehensive buff battle style. If they still could not win, they might as well jump off their horses and fall to their deaths. At this moment, only the 40 scouts led by Sodeler, Ruger, and Carter were really participating in the battle. The 20 paladins were all sitting on horseback behind Roddy, each holding a warhorse in their hands. They were waiting patiently as a reserve team. The entire battlefield was monitored by Roddy with his environmental acuity. His eyes were cold, and he held a short bow in his hand, but he had no intention of shooting. He just sat quietly on horseback like an emotionless war machine. In 2 minutes, the charge of Sodeler and the others had caused the morale of the enemy in the camp to collapse. The soldiers who had originally wanted to resist could not bear the pressure and began to flee in large numbers. The whereabouts of Natha and the others were soon interrogated from the captive. Roddy just nodded after receiving the news, and then expressionlessly shot an arrow. When the sharp whistle sounded, the 40 scouts almost immediately turned their horses and began to gather. 10 seconds later, with Roddy's silent tactical gesture, the whole team immediately left the devastated camp and charged straight into Kegtown. The iron discipline brought the whole team unimaginably terrifying efficiency. When the second charge began, Roddy's figure rushed straight to the front with a short bow in his hand. This is just the first step. It won't end so easily. The low murmur was drowned in the rumbling sound of hooves. Roddy turned his head slightly and looked gloomily at Earl Owen, who was coming from a distance, and then disappeared in the dust raised by the team's galloping. 2 minutes after the whole team left, Earl Owen, who came from the north of the town, had just arrived at his camp. At this time, it was no longer a camp, but a ruin. Owen was flanked by 2 barons and 100 guards. Before coming here, he thought he would see Sodeler and the others trapped in the camp. But what he saw made him speechless, and he didn't even know what to say. The camp had collapsed, the ground was in a mess, and the soldiers were running in all directions. In less than 6 minutes, the enemy had smashed their camp into pieces and left. If it were not for the groaning knights and squires on the ground, who had been cut by swords and sabers, Earl Owen would have even thought that this was the result of being attacked by a tornado. Gather everyone. I'm going to tear them into pieces." Earl Owen, who never showed his emotions, was completely enraged at this time, and even stuttered a little. He held the hilt of his sword, his body trembling slightly, and his knuckles were pale. In many years, this was the first time that someone had challenged his authority to his face. Or rather, this was no longer a provocation, but a direct slap in his face and then a spit in his face. "Go after them. Kill them without mercy. I don't want any prisoners of war." The roar resounded through the messy camp. Without saying a word, The two barons next to him rushed in the direction of Roddy and the others with their subordinate knights and troops, and the other lords in the distance also began to move. At this moment, more than 1,200 soldiers outside Geiger Town pressed into the town. It took at least 20 minutes for the knights to put on their armor, so at this time, all the soldiers who rushed forward were infantry. Although they were at a disadvantage in the face of cavalry, the suppression of 20 times the number of soldiers made this problem negligible. Although he was shocked by the combat power of Roddy and the others, Earl Owen still firmly believed that these seemingly brave guys were just carrying out the last charge in their lives. How dare they be so arrogant with just 60 people? Earl Owen no longer concealed his ferocious expression and loudly ordered the knights who had reached the advanced level, "Before evening, I want to see all their heads placed in Geiger Town." "Yes, master." In the orderly response, the muffled sound of houses collapsing came faintly from Geiger Town in the distance. When Earl Owen's camp was attacked, the captive escort team at the edge of Geiger Town had no idea what was happening in the distance. At this time, the team had just walked out of the town. After leaving the densely built streets, there were a lot more trees around them than before. Such a terrain made the village chief Brody, who had not spoken a word, raise his eyes slightly and narrow his eyes. "Natha, do you remember the way before?" The guards who were guarding Brody frowned when they heard the sudden words spoken in the Elven language. Naturally, they did not understand who he was talking to because Brody had been looking forward all along. 10 meters away, Natha was trying hard to resist the heavy shackles on her feet. When she heard this, she suddenly remembered that Brody did not cast any spells throughout the whole battle. "After I cast the spell, run back to the forest along the way and don't look back." Brody's voice was very low, and he looked around at the same time. Several soldiers said things like, "Old thing, shut up," and pushed him. Brody staggered and then fell to the ground because his hands were tied together. However, Brody did not seem to care about such treatment at all. When he reached out and touched the ground, he quietly pulled out a few grass stems that had not completely withered yet. As an elder who had experienced several wars, Brody's view of the overall situation was naturally far better than Natha's. He did not cast any spells when he was surrounded earlier because he was very clear about his situation. The enemy outnumbered him 10 times, and even if he cast any spells, it would be useless. Therefore, Brody chose to endure it. He understood that Roddy would definitely not be able to rush here to help at this time. Thus, from the beginning, he was prepared to escape with Natha. Up until now, all the preparations had been completed. The awkward fall at this moment was the opportunity for the plan to begin. "Old Bones, stand up." Seeing Brody fall, the soldier at the side reached out and wanted to pull him up roughly. However, when he reached out, a dark green light flashed in his vision. "What the hell is this?" Before he could finish speaking, the loud noise coming from the front completely drowned his shouts. Chapter 238. When the green light flashed and Brody broke free from the ropes that bound his hands, most of the soldiers did not notice his resistance. At the same time, the cavalry led by Roddy appeared in front of them. "Meet the enemy! Meet the enemy! Forward! Gather together!" Compared to the defenseless camp, Earl Owen's subordinates were more powerful. They were fully armed. In addition to 160 infantrymen, there were also 40 mounted on horses. Whether it was in terms of numbers or morale, they did not fear Roddy's cavalry. After a moment of clamor, the 40 knights immediately accelerated and charged forward. With their shining swords in their hands, these proud knights were not weak at all. However, after all the knights rushed out, the soldiers who were left behind fell into chaos. This army did not have a unified leader, and each knight had no authority over each other. Therefore, the retainers and soldiers who were left behind only listened to the orders of their own knight. Therefore, some retainers chased after the knights and charged forward, while some stayed behind to guard the prisoners of war. As a result, the originally orderly army suddenly squeezed into a ball. After half a minute, the army finally separated. The 40 knights led 120 infantrymen to meet the enemy, while only about 40 people stayed behind to guard the prisoners of war. According to the ratio, it was not difficult for 2 people to guard a prisoner of war. However, the soldiers who stayed behind discovered a serious problem. The seemingly weak old wood elf had actually broken free from his shackles. The soldiers beside Broody were all tied up by the vines and had fallen to the ground. They had completely lost their fighting strength. As Brody continued to recite his incantations, the trees on both sides started to shake violently. The thick tree trunks started to move with a creaking sound, as if they had a consciousness of their own. The soldiers who were closer to them were sent flying away on the spot. "Stop him! Quickly stop him!" The soldier in front of him waved his sword and wanted to rush over, but he tripped over the vines on the ground and fell flat on his face. However, his shout made his companions turn around, and then more soldiers drew their weapons and swarmed over. Natha reacted immediately when she saw Broody's sudden attack. Her upper body was bound by ropes and her feet were shackled. However, with her amazing explosive strength, Natha took a side step and suddenly rushed forward. She headbutted the soldier beside her and knocked him unconscious. However, her actions were filled with hatred. Because her arms were bound, she lost her balance and fell to the ground. Another soldier wanted to seize the opportunity to hold down Natha, but his jaw was broken by her slender legs. Natha's actions were cruel and merciless. Her heart was filled with hatred for humans. Instead, he frantically tore one scroll after another, releasing the sealed curse power in them. Curse, fear. Curse, weakness. Curse, confusion. Curse, confusion. Curse, blindness. Rhodey did not have a lot of mana, but it was not a problem for him to cast these curses that consumed only 10 points of mana. The 7 scrolls were thrown out. Although they did not cause any direct damage, the effect they caused made the distant knights feel like they had fallen into an ice cave. When the debuff effect appeared, the knights who were originally clustered together instantly fell into extreme chaos. Some knights and their warhorses slowed down sharply, some screamed and wanted to turn their horses and run in the opposite direction, and some even directly slashed their long swords at their comrades next to them. The charging team could not withstand such an unforeseen event. A large number of knights fell off their horses in the chaos, followed by a series of chain reactions. The entire team was forced to slow down, and the knights at the back hurriedly dodged to the sides. But in this state of rapid galloping, the moment the knights pulled the reins, they found that the scouts 100 meters away were already in front of them. Boom dash, the sound of spears breaking filled the air. Splinters and blood flew everywhere, obscuring one's vision. The scenery retreated rapidly, and countless figures streaked past. It looked like the collision of 2 cavalry regiments, but if one looked closely, one would find that these knights were almost directly run over by Roddy's cavalry regiment. Roddy, who was charging at the forefront, had taken the stoneskin potion, and activated the tortoise shield, at the same time as the holy shield. To a certain extent, his defense as the main tank had risen to the peak within 3 seconds, and there was almost no possibility of him getting hurt. So under his leadership, the whole team effortlessly tore apart the entire battle formation. A few swords that attacked Roddy could not even break through the holy shield, and the knights that tried to attack Roddy were pierced into sieves by the cavalry spears in the blink of an eye. Out of the 40 knights, 7 died from falling off their horses before they could face the attack. When Roddy led the scouts past, 17 of them died on the spot, and the remaining heavily injured did not have the desire to continue fighting. All of them lost all their courage, and fled into the distance without looking back. All of this happened too quickly, and the outcome was decided within 30 seconds. On Roddy's side, Other than 3 scouts who fell off their horses and were heavily injured, the rest of the people actually maintained their full combat strength. And after the 2 sides clashed, the 20 Holy Temple soldiers who followed behind immediately began to help the injured scouts. Under the effects of the intermediate healing spell and intermediate healing potion, these injured people who originally needed 3 to 4 months of recuperation actually had their bones reset on the spot, their wounds healed, and they once again mounted their horses and joined the battle formation. From this, it could be seen that Roddy's training of Akasha was correct, and it could also be seen that his habit of being willing to spend money in battle had nurtured such a frightening troop of morale. After flattening the camp and directly defeating a 40-man cavalry regiment, all of them still maintained their terrifying combat strength, and as if they had endless fighting spirit, they continued to charge towards the hundreds of infantrymen rushing over from the back. The broken lances were discarded, and the long swords were thrown away. The scouts tirelessly pulled out their secondary weapons, and under Sodeler's lead, they launched their 3rd charge today. In front of them, the infantrymen who had witnessed the 40 knights being slaughtered were already scared out of their wits, and almost before they came into contact with the enemy, they showed signs of collapsing. However, the attack speed of Roddy and the others was too fast. In just half a minute, they rushed into the battle formation of these scattered squires. As if it only took a moment, Roddy's knights broke through the formation again, without a single casualty. Out of the 120 infantrymen, 35 were dead or injured. They could not organize a second defense at all, and were completely routed under this overwhelming attack. 3 lines of defense, 3 charges. Roddy led his cavalry regiment into the town of Kyger without stopping, and appeared in front of the captured Holy Temple Knights. Chapter 239. When Roddy led the cavalry to the last batch of enemies, these fellows who had completely lost their fighting spirit scattered in all directions. They didn't even have the courage to fight anymore. The swaying trees no longer swayed. The soldiers who were entangled by the vines on the ground also stopped struggling. The paladins who were cheering Roddy's name just now stood there and silently looked at the young man who had broken through 3 layers of defense just to save them. "You have 3 minutes to rest, then we will set off." Roddy looked at the temple knights who were tied up with ropes and calmly pointed behind him. "We still have a battle to fight." Looking at the direction where Roddy was pointing, the knights could vaguely see groups of soldiers coming from the outskirts of the town. After breaking through the enemy's 3 layers of defense, Roddy calmly gave the knights an indescribable shock. What they felt more was Roddy's tenacious conviction of not abandoning anyone. No amount of words could compare to Roddy's decisive action. Perhaps some of the knights had some complaints about Roddy previously, but from this moment on, whether it was the captive or the temple guards who came along to support, they were completely convinced. The ropes were cut and Akasha's recovery spell fell on their bodies. Bottles of potions were stuffed into their hands. These knights looked at the warhorses that were being led over and reached out to hold the weapons hanging on the saddles. They all felt an inexplicable excitement. They never thought that the time to counterattack would come so quickly. When Fatty Henry received the potion, he was shocked by the value it represented. As a mercenary, he had the right not to participate in such a battle. But after unscrewing the cap and drinking the potion, he silently made a decision. He turned around and mounted his horse, joining the team without saying a word. On the other side, the conversation between Roddy and Brody was short but meaningful. "I didn't expect you to really bring a team here." The old elf's tone was rather rueful. His impression of humans was that they were greedy and selfish. As for Roddy, he had never thought that the other party would have such boldness. A team of less than 60 people actually dared to directly charge through the enemy's layers of defense and rush to their rescue. This kind of matter had really changed Brody's understanding of humans. "Rescuing them is something that I should do. I apologize for the suffering they have suffered because of me. Roddy's gaze stopped on Natha. The latter lowered her eyes, but she had no intention of looking at him directly. Roddy could understand this, but when he saw the shackles on Natha's feet, his eyes suddenly narrowed. The heavy shackles left bloody marks on Natha's ankles. Roddy didn't ask about her well-being. He turned around and asked the enemies who were bound by vines for the whereabouts of the key. Then, he personally searched for it and unlocked Natha's shackles. Natha looked at Roddy's actions. Although she tried her best to maintain a cold expression, there was a moment when the wood elf maiden's expression finally changed a little, but when the dense footsteps sounded, Natha understood that it was time to leave. The encirclement of more than 1,200 soldiers was huge, and the scattered cavalrymen who followed behind gradually gathered together. She could even see the figures of a few feudal lords among them. Roddy didn't seem to notice at all. He continued to calmly lead the warhorses for Brody and Natha. But just as he was carrying the spare quiver on his back, Brody suddenly said, "If you want to leave, the team can continue to the south of the town from here." Roddy raised his brows. "I've planted some seeds along the way. If needed, I can block the enemies passing through here for a period of time." This was the reason why Brody had emphasized to Natha that they should go back the way they came. Due to Roddy's rescue, Brody had originally neglected this plan, but when he saw the enemies surrounding them, he still reminded them. "You want to use violent growth and guardian soul?" Roddy immediately switched to the elven language to converse. The two spell names stunned Brody, because Roddy's judgment was absolutely correct. Obtaining the answer from Brody's expression, Roddy then said, "Then lower the height of violent growth to below the knees and cast it together with guardian soul. This way I can hold the enemies back a little longer." This wasn't a discussion. Brody agreed readily and was helped onto the warhorse. Sodeler, Ruger, Carter. "There are some changes to the plan." Roddy turned around and gave a simple assignment to the captains. 30 seconds later, he nimbly waved his hand. "Get on the horse, move out." Once the order was given, the scouts immediately followed Ruger and Carter along the road. The Holy Knights who had been rescued became a separate team of guards, escorting the two wood elves as they retreated. At this moment, all of Roddy's soldiers maintained high mobility. The combat unit had a full complement of 84 people. In terms of combat objectives, Roddy had already completed half of his mission. He had rescued the two wood elves, and the next thing he needed to do was to successfully escape from the enemy's encirclement. This plan was within everyone's expectations. Even the surrounding nobles thought that Roddy's next move would be to escape from the town. But they would never have imagined that when a PvP player who knew how to make use of all conditions decided on certain things, he would make a terrifying counterattack. "Do you really think you can do whatever you want just because you have more people?" Roddy looked at the street in the distance and said in a mocking tone. As the footsteps approached, a group of more than 20 infantrymen appeared at the corner of the street. The sound of hooves could be heard as the knights sped up and left. Amidst the billowing smoke and dust, Natha on horseback felt extremely complicated. She really wanted to let go of the idea of hating humans and leave. But when she saw Roddy madly rushing in front of her, she was so strongly touched that she was unknowingly pulled by Brody to follow the team. When the team gradually started moving, Natha turned her head to look at Roddy, only to find that he had actually stayed there alone. It felt as if everyone had abandoned Roddy. Natha did not know why she suddenly felt a little flustered. When she turned to look at Brody, the old village chief shook his head. "Since he has made his own decision, there is no need to ask further." Akasha, who also looked back frequently, had the same worry in her heart. But when she thought of Roddy's confidence and coldness in assigning tasks, she finally held back those messy thoughts. She tightened her grip on the cloth bag containing the scrolls beside her and ran along the predetermined route, the shouts of the infantrymen could already be heard on the street. The first batch of soldiers who arrived only saw the smoke and dust left behind by the cavalry. But what made them feel strange was that, after the smoke and dust dispersed, there was a lone figure holding a short bough left in the middle of the street. A green light flashed across the sky. Brody's violent growth spell caused the main street that ran from the north to the south of Gigtown to instantly grow countless short plants. With the release of Guardian Spirit, Roddy's figure also slowly retreated into the shadows of the buildings beside him in the sight of the pursuers. "He's escaping! Catch him! Kill as many as you can!" In the spacious and empty Gigtown, the soldiers swarmed toward Roddy while shouting loudly. Behind them, Earl Owen was joining the scattered troops of the other four lords to form the second encirclement from the side of the town. This troop of about 100 people was all riding warhorses. Among them, there were 4 advanced level, 5 knights under Earl Owen, and an advanced level 3 elementalist, who followed Earl Durant in the middle of the troop. The lineup was unusually strong. In the rear of the various lords' positions, there were more than 200 knights in armor, anxiously preparing to join in the encirclement of Roddy and the others. The doors of the residents in the town were tightly shut, and outside the town, there was a dense net that was slowly being drawn in. Under such a situation, the prelude of cat and mouse was slowly unfolding. The rumbling sound of horses' hooves roared outside the door, and the vibration of the ground caused waves of ripples in the water cup. Serene picked up the cup and tried to drink a few mouthfuls of cold water to calm himself down, but his hand holding the cup could not help but tremble. It was not because of panic, but because the sound of horses' hooves brought back memories that made Serene feel angry. Serene was not a cobbler who started his career as a leathermaker when he was young. In fact, he was actually a mercenary when he was young. Although the mercenary group he was in at that time was not of a high level and the pay was not generous, Serene was very satisfied with his life at that time. However, all the changes happened 7 years ago. Serene found a flashing stone tablet in the wild, which brought a fatal disaster to the whole mercenary group. If Serene had not hidden in a stone crack that ordinary people could not detect because he was short, perhaps he would not have escaped the fate of being dumped in the wilderness. Serene deeply remembered the insignia on the chest of those who killed him, and later learned that this filthy plunder was led by Earl Owen. He tried to resist and retaliate, but as a powerless mercenary, Serene's fate could be imagined. Today, the cruel reality had long smoothed the edges of his heart. Being a mediocre cobbler might be a good result, but today, when he saw those knights who humiliated him, Serene still could not suppress the anger that was once buried deep in his heart. Was he going to continue to endure like this? Boom! The sound of an explosion outside the door interrupted his memory. Serene raised his head and looked at the closed door of the shop in confusion. Over there! Over there! These damn trees! They know magic! Get out of this street! Earl Owen said he would pay 1 gold coin for each head. Everyone must, After a short scream, there was the sound of a heavy object falling to the ground. Su Luan could clearly hear someone falling from the roof of his shop to the ground. There was a plop, and then there was no more movement. However, their conversation made Serene frown. Is someone going against Earl Owen? Who was so bold? Chapter 240. Through the narrow gap, Serene saw a soldier who was shot by an arrow not far from the window. As a former mercenary, Serene was able to discern many things from a simple arrow. The soldier in front of him had obviously died from a ruptured heart, which meant that the arrow was extremely accurate, and the strength of the arrow was beyond imagination. Also, Serene squinted his eyes and found that there was a layer of white frost on the soldier's chest. Su Luan was extremely astonished. He had heard of martial experts who could add frost abilities to their arrows, but those were basically legendary figures. They were not people he could come into contact with at his level. The street was unusually empty, but the soldiers who rushed into the town were shouting and yelling. They did not use any tactical gestures, and even their accents were different. Needless to say, they were not coordinated at all. Therefore, after searching for a long time, they did not even see Roddy's shadow. But such a situation gave rise to some incidents. As they could not find Roddy, the soldiers could not help but start to search the suspicious shops and residences. Muffled sounds of doors being kicked and cursed could be heard from the street. There were also the cries of women and children mixed in. When a war broke out, the soldiers often became completely unscrupulous. They were loyal to the Lord and did not care about the law here. Even if something happened, the Lord and the nobles would bear the responsibility, and they would not be held responsible. With that in mind, some of the soldiers were not interested in besieging Roddy. Instead, they started to plunder and loot. As they could not find Roddy, a team of 10 people started to search the vicinity of Su Luan's shop. One of them looked at Su Luan's shop's name and without hesitation, he kicked the wooden door of the shop. Serene, who was inside the house, was startled. Then, he was extremely angry. He clenched his teeth and pushed the window open, shouting, "What are you doing?" Hearing his question, the soldier outside the door rushed to the window without saying a word and shouted, "Open the door!" At the same time, he reached out to grab Su Luan's collar, but Su Luan took a step back and dodged. "You dare to dodge? Damn shorty, you're dead meat today." This kind of threat sounded very low, but Serene knew that the soldier was not joking. The tragedy that had happened in the past made Serene feel an uncontrollable fear. He was not afraid of the soldier himself, but he was afraid of the person behind the emblem on his chest. Earl Owen. While Serene was in a daze, the soldier standing in front of the window suddenly trembled, and his face instantly revealed a look of pain and struggle. Under Serene's surprised gaze, the soldier's mouth was covered by a hand from behind, and his entire body fell backwards. However, the person behind him supported him and slowly lowered him to the ground. The soldier breathed his last within 3 seconds, not making a single sound from beginning to end. "Oh, we meet again, Master Su Luan." The figure behind the soldier slowly stood up and spoke casually, but Serene was shocked. Only then did he realize that it was the guy he had been waiting for. Serene did not want to cause trouble, but when he saw that Earl Owen's soldier was killed, he felt unprecedentedly refreshed. His impulsive mood made him abandon his principle of not causing trouble. He directly moved away from the window and shouted at Roddy, You, come in! Come in quickly!" Roddy was a little surprised, but after looking around, he jumped into the shop through the window. After he entered the room, Su Luan quickly pulled the window shut. "My name is Roddy." Roddy stood up and calmly introduced himself. His tone was very flat. However, Serene was slightly panting because of excitement and nervousness. He seemed to be a little unable to believe what he had just seen. He asked in a trembling voice, You killed someone?" Mercenaries were not necessarily people who lived on the edge of a knife. Serene had never killed anyone, so he was very shocked. "Oh, I see that his attitude towards you is not very good, so," Roddy shrugged, and his tone was calm as if he had not just killed someone, but pulled out a blade of grass. Serene was a little confused by Roddy's answer. He could not help but look at the window again. When he turned back to look at Roddy, he found that Roddy was carrying a short bow on his back. Are you fighting with them?" Serene vaguely guessed a certain possibility in his heart, but it was a little ridiculous. How could such a disheveled guy, who was wearing a torn leather armor, dare to fight against Earl Owen's soldiers alone? "It's not really a fight. I just have some misunderstanding with them that I need to clarify." Roddy responded very seriously, and then did not continue to chat. Instead, he naturally took out an arrow and threw it forward. The arrowhead was nailed to the wooden frame next to the window. "I'll compensate for the damage caused." Serene opened his mouth slightly and wanted to say something, But the next moment, he saw Roddy pick up the exquisite short bow, open the window, and smoothly take out an arrow from the window frame. He knocked the arrow, drew the bow, and took aim. This almost scared serene crazy. There were at least 9 soldiers outside. Attacking like this was completely suicidal. However, Roddy's movements were smooth and quick. His confidence and powerful momentum made serene unable to say anything after he opened his mouth. When he saw the frost on the chest of the dead body, he suddenly felt that he did not understand what kind of role Roddy was at all. Serene's steps froze. He wiped his red nose and hesitantly looked in the direction where Roddy's arrow was pointing. The window of the leather shop was not big. From Serene's point of view, his field of vision could only be considered narrow. Even so, he could still see 3 soldiers jogging towards him from the middle of the street. They were shouting things like "Paul got shot," "Beware of hidden arrows," "That guy might be nearby," and so on. The lighting in the leather shop was dim, but there was plenty of sunlight outside. So when the soldiers looked at the dead body on the ground, they did not notice the steady short bow a meter behind the window. The 3 of them got closer and closer. When they were about 10 meters away from Roddy, one of them said, "We must surround this bastard." Roddy listened to their conversation with an expressionless face. Then, he naturally turned the arrow around. With a muffled sound, blood splattered, and one of the soldiers was sent flying. Because the distance was too close, the arrow exploded the soldier's head with extreme force. The second and third arrows did not stop, and they killed the remaining 2 soldiers on the spot. At that moment, Suluan finally understood why Roddy wanted to nail the arrow to the window frame. It was so that the action of drawing the arrow would be smoother and the shooting speed would be faster. Roddy's usage of the details in a small-scale PvP battle was at its peak. Standing in the room, he was almost like a sniper. Retreating a meter behind the window might seem casual, but in fact, it gave Roddy an absolute advantage. The other 7 soldiers sensed the commotion and appeared in Roddy's field of vision, unaware of what was going on. Serene thought he had seen a lot of things after years of being a mercenary, but what he saw next was the scariest and calmest massacre he had ever seen in his life. Roddy faced the window with his feet nailed to the ground. 3 seconds after the 7 soldiers entered his field of vision, he pulled the bowstring with his right hand and released it. Then, the sound of the bowstring cutting through the air became continuous. There were no screams or cries, only the soldiers' shouts and the muffled thuds of bodies falling to the ground. Serene stared at the window with cold sweat all over his body. He clearly saw that none of Roddy's arrows missed, and all of them were fatal. The street instantly returned to silence, but another group of soldiers' shouts and footsteps could be heard from afar. Roddy did not intend to stay here any longer. He put away his bow and prepared to leave, but when he turned around, he seemed to remember something and said to Serene, "I'll come back to collect the armor pieces. I think it'll be in a few days." Roddy's calmness sent a chill down Serene's spine. If he had just killed a 10-man squad, he would probably be trembling with excitement and fear. However, Roddy's expression was no different from when they first met. It was as if he was really here to talk business. I'm fine, that's good." Roddy smiled warmly. "It's a pleasure working with you." As soon as he finished speaking, he jumped up and dashed out of the leather shop, heading straight for the squad that was charging at him from afar. Serene rushed to the window and stared with wide eyes. In his field of vision, he saw Roddy shooting 3 arrows in a row. He then reached into his inventory and took out a scroll. When the soldiers were about 15 meters away from him, he tore it open. A faint red light flashed. The curse, chaos, stunned the soldiers at the front, and they immediately started attacking their comrades behind them. Roddy slowed down his pace and shot one arrow after another. When he got close to the soldiers, he pulled out his scimitar and started killing them like a tiger in a flock of sheep. After advancing to level 3, Roddy's attributes completely crushed these militias, who were only level 5. Kicking and slashing, he finished the battle in less than 7 seconds. Roddy pulled out the arrows that he could retrieve and put them back into the quiver. He then looked at the leather shop and saw that Su Luan was staring at him. Roddy waved his hand and mouthed, "That's right. Close the window." Serene slammed the window shut. He gasped for air as if he had collapsed. He then slowly sat down on the ground. Roddy. Who the hell is this guy? Serene felt like he just had a nightmare when he heard the shouts outside the window. On the other side, Roddy had already used the combination of sprint and leap to run 3 streets away in less than 10 seconds. Chapter 241. They can't get out of the town. The middle street is filled with plants, and there seems to be spellcasters among them. There's an archer causing a lot of damage, and our soldiers can't stop him at all. When the news was passed to the feudal lords, Earl Owen, who had vowed to tear apart Roddy's bones and skin, had an increasingly ugly expression on his face. He never thought that his team of so many people could not find the enemy after more than 10 minutes of besieging the town. How could 80 cavalrymen disappear for no reason? Not only that, but the fleeing soldiers also brought him a piece of news that shocked and angered him. The captives, who were supposed to be used as bargaining chips, had been successfully rescued by Sodeler's men. This news almost made Baron Owen's face turn as red as a pig's liver. When he came to Guytown, he thought that he was the most powerful noble. He had the most soldiers, the most knights, and the greatest power and prestige. No matter how he thought about it, he should not be at a disadvantage. But in less than an hour, 70% of his troops were trampled by 60 cavalrymen. Such a fact was tantamount to giving Earl Owen a hard slap in the face in front of all the lords. Earl Durant could no longer hide the sarcastic smile on his face. The remaining barons looked at him differently, and there was no longer any fear or awe in their eyes, and all of this was caused by that fellow called Sodeler. Earl Owen gritted his teeth fiercely. In his heart, he immediately identified this new baron as the culprit. He looked up at the seemingly peaceful town in the distance and immediately gave a death order. "I don't expect you to surround them. As long as you find the position of the troops, report it immediately. I want to use the cavalry to wipe out his troops. Go now." "Can so many cavalrymen disappear into thin air?" "Yes, Lord Earl." The soldiers accepted the order and left while trembling with fear. Earl Durant quickly proposed a feasible plan. "My subordinate, Cohen, is very good at detection. If you want to solve the problem as soon as possible, I can ask Cohen to help." This Cohen was an elementalist under Durant. Hearing his words, the other lords agreed and immediately sent their capable men to form a mixed team. This was the only tacit understanding they had after they formed a united front. Although Earl Owen was reluctant, he still let 3 of the 4 advanced knights join the team. Thus, a temporary assault team was quickly assembled. Among them were an elementalist and 3 advanced knights, while the rest were 40 experienced knights. In terms of battle prowess, they weren't inferior to the cavalry regiment led by Sodeler at all, and might even be stronger. "Catch those guys. 1 gold coin for each head." Earl Durante gave an order to the elementalist called Cohen. The latter nodded arrogantly and rushed towards the town without even looking at the surrounding knights. The knights in the rear moved at the same time, and for a moment it was a great momentum. After they rushed into the town, more than 200 knights from the outer camp also rushed over, followed by the remaining 600 infantry. Earl Owen looked at such a lineup of reinforcements, and the panic that had just risen in his heart was involuntarily suppressed. With such a siege, they definitely can't escape even if they grow wings. Earl Owen was not the only one who made such a conclusion. The other lords looked at Geiger Town that had been completely surrounded, and they had already determined in their hearts what would happen to Sodeler. However, at the same time, a group of 20 people suddenly appeared from the south of the town. They rushed out of the town without any obstruction and ran into the forest in the south under the surprised gazes of the feudal lords. What's going on? Not only Earl Owen, but the other lords were also a little dumbfounded. They were about 1,500 meters away from this team, and everyone saw that this team did not encounter any battle during the process of escaping. Not even a soldier appeared to stop them. A gap in the encirclement? A loophole in the defense line? A mole let them through? Before all these doubts could be confirmed, Cohen, who had just rushed into the town, sent out a faint blue signal to the sky. Obviously, he had found traces of the enemy. This news should have made the lords heave a sigh of relief, but when they saw the symbol and the escaping troops pointing in the opposite direction of the fleeing troops, all the nobles felt that the entire battle seemed to have been completely disrupted by an invisible hand, and was headed towards a completely unknown path. Roddy was not a god, and he never thought that he could kill these thousands of enemies. But as a PvP player who had been on the battlefield all year round, he had 10,000 ways to distract the enemy's attention. Roddy was not blindly confident. The reason why he dared to launch a counterattack in this extremely disadvantageous situation was entirely because, in this era, there had never been a war that took place in a town. All the lords and soldiers had never heard of the concept of urban warfare. Vision, commanding heights, suppressive fire. The soldiers who rushed into the town did not understand the importance of these 3 points. In their eyes, the moment they entered the town, it meant the end of the battle. That was why in the past 10 minutes, more than 200 soldiers had been diverted because of Rhodey. Unknowingly, they had made way for Rhodey in the town. And it was through this passage that Roddy had created that the 2 wood elves and 20 holy temple soldiers who were not good at horsemanship, that they had successfully escaped. Such a thing was simply unimaginable to outsiders, and Natha and the others who ran all the way out were even more incredulous. They were obviously in the most intense and terrifying encirclement, but they did not even see a shadow and easily escaped. Such a huge contrast made them have a strong sense of worship for Roddy, but this plan was only the first step in Roddy's plan. He was still in Gigtown, using deadly arrows to distract the enemy's attention. Over there! Look at the sign. Surround them! Earl Owen has sent reinforcements. Shouts came one after another, and as the huge sign condensed by the elementalist appeared in the sky, the chaotic soldiers finally flocked towards Roddy as if they had a backbone. Roddy was originally running in the direction of Earl Owen, but when he saw Cohen leading a group of powerful knights into the town, he immediately slowed down, and then slightly changed direction, running along a narrow street towards the south. However, he had only run a few steps when a voice came into Roddy's ears from afar. "You have nowhere to run!" What followed was an icicle technique that was not very powerful but extremely fast. Bang! The shattered icicles exploded at Roddy's side. However, he was too lazy to even turn his head to the side in such a situation. He curled his lips and said disdainfully, Master Mage, you can only call me Master after level 30. But now you're so arrogant, really." Before Roddy could finish his ridicule, the sorcerer named Cohen continued to shout, "Those who have been targeted by me have no chance of escaping. Wake up early. Running away is useless. Come and bite me." Roddy flipped over a wall, and did not pull out an arrow to counterattack. He only turned around and shouted, and then leaped to the adjacent street. Cohen's face immediately changed color, and he angrily controlled his horse to give chase. In terms of speed, no matter how fast Roddy ran, he would never be able to catch up with a warhorse. However, because of the combination of leaping and galloping, Roddy could ignore the terrain and easily avoid the cavalry. Therefore, in the next 3 minutes, Cohen, who was in hot pursuit, shouted, "You're dead meat," as he ran through the narrow streets and alleys. His talent had strengthened the original 2 seconds of casting time of the icicle spell to instant casting. Although its power was reduced, and the cooldown was extended to 6 seconds, it was still enough to pose a threat to Roddy while he was on horseback. Along the way, 7 to 8 icicles shattered beside Roddy, and it seemed that he had been forced into a corner. Cohen did not believe that a human's stamina could be stronger than a warhorse's. He looked at Roddy, who was dodging left and right, and suddenly felt like he was trying to catch a stubborn fish. When his opponent's stamina was exhausted, it would be the end of him. "Run, let's see how long you can run," Cohen cursed in a low voice. As expected, after 3 minutes of continuous pursuit, Roddy's footsteps finally slowed down, and finally stopped in the middle of a crossroad. He held onto his knees in exhaustion, gasping for breath. Sweat flowed down his cheeks and dripped onto the ground. No matter how strong his physical attributes were, running and fighting for such a long time had really pushed Roddy to the limits of his body. Roddy bent his back slightly, trying to take deep breaths. Not far from him, Cohen, who had been chasing him all the way, finally revealed a sinister smile. He jumped off his horse 30 meters away, took out his magic wand, and cast an ice shield. He then shouted, "Run! Keep running! Damn rat! Let's see how you're going to hide this time." Cohen's character was arrogant, and he basically looked down on everyone, even the group of knights behind him who were unable to keep up due to the narrow road. Apart from that, his habit of being overconfident made him feel an extreme desire to kill Roddy. Cohen stopped in his tracks, and waves of elemental condensation filled the surroundings. He looked at Roddy, who was still panting, and raised his hand to cast a fireball spell. At the same time, he asked mockingly, "Why? Have you given up on resisting?" Roddy straightened his back and slowly exhaled. He shrugged and said, "I just feel that resisting or not resisting is something you need to consider." As soon as he finished speaking, a large number of figures holding short bows stood up on the roofs of the buildings around the crossroad. Chapter 242. How could he dodge? The elementalist Cohen's grin froze on his face, his brain completely short-circuited. Due to the long and narrow streets, there were only 2 knights who had followed Cohen here. Both of them were still 20 meters behind. The rest of the knights had already been dragged into a line of more than 100 meters long, and they were all rushing here like a swarm of bees. So at this moment, Cohen was basically exposed to the firepower of more than 10 people. Time seemed to pass very slowly on the battlefield. Cohen opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but when he looked at Roddy, he realized that Roddy had already knocked an arrow on his bow. "Don't be so funny in your next life." Roddy's exploding arrow suddenly streaked across the air. Although the ice shield was strong, it could not withstand the precision of Roddy's shield destroyer attack. The arrow instantly nailed into the surface of the ice shield at a vertical angle, and then exploded, instantly shattering the entire shield into pieces. Roddy broke the shield in one shot, much more relaxed than when he faced Francis. Cohen was so frightened that he screamed and raised his wand to cast other spells, but before he could even chant any spells, he was shot into a hedgehog with a series of muffled sounds. A dignified advanced elementalist fell to the ground with blood spurting out of his body before he could even cast a fireball spell. This scene shocked the knights who were rushing over from behind. They couldn't help but pull on the reins and stop in the middle of the crossroad. Roddy then stretched his back, completely ignoring the knights, and turned to the side of a 2-story building. "Aim, fire!" The command echoed above the surrounding buildings. Behind Roddy, the scouts with short bows in their hands had already launched the next round of volleys, followed by the screams and screams of the knights. This was the advantage of suppressing fire from a commanding position. Although the speed of arrows in the era of cold weapons was not as fast as cannons, concentrated fire in a narrow space was still a nightmare for close combat soldiers. "Despicable! They are here! Do not retreat! Forward! Forward!" The cavalrymen who were rushing over were in a situation where they could only take a beating without retaliating. However, due to the advantage of their armors, they did not suffer too many casualties. It was just that the death of the elementalist Cohen was a huge blow to the morale of the cavalrymen, causing their advance to slow down. They were hesitating whether to retreat or attack. However, just as they were hesitating, the sound of horse hooves suddenly came from all around them, causing these knights to collectively freeze. Originally, they thought that this was the second batch of reinforcements sent by the feudal lords. However, when the knights at the crossroads looked around, they realized that the cavalrymen charging towards them were all unfamiliar faces. Enemy! They're enemies! Prepare for battle! Draw your sword! When the knights realized the problem, panic spread uncontrollably. They were the ones besieging the enemy, so how could they be besieged by the enemy at this crossroad? Even the advanced knights felt as if they had been hit in the head by a hammer. They really couldn't understand how these guys dared to counter-surround them when they were surrounded by thousands of soldiers. What happened to this world? How could a cat be surrounded and beaten by mice? At this moment, the suzerains on the outskirts still believed that they had victory in their grasp. The 1,000 soldiers who were chasing after them were wandering aimlessly 4 or 5 streets away. Meanwhile, the 200 cavalrymen who were following behind them had just stepped into the town. Perhaps in 3 to 5 minutes, these soldiers would be able to encircle the town. But now this so-called elite force could only helplessly face the 3-pronged attack of Roddy's cavalry. Cavalry charge! Sodeler's command resounded throughout the entire street. In a short 20 seconds, the 3 cavalrymen sped up at full speed. Before the noble knights could even put up a resistance, they crashed into their scattered formation. The sounds of collisions and slashing resounded through the street. Even though they were all mounted cavalrymen, they were still standing where they were. They were like wheat being harvested. In just one exchange, more than 10 people were killed on 3 different sides. The 3 advanced knights originally wanted to resist, but because they were positioned at the back, they could only watch helplessly as their troops were pushed to the back. The effect of the experience from the Orc King was obvious. In terms of strength, the Knights of the Nobles were not weaker than Roddy's cavalry. However, they did not have the bravery and passion of the scouts when they were charging at them. More importantly, they didn't have the conviction to fight. And the charging scouts and holy knights knew very well that the enemies in front of them were the subordinates of the traitors of the kingdom. Their existence was a disgrace to the kingdom's glory. Kill these traitors. For the glory of the kingdom of Karen. Carter roared. On the chaotic battlefield, all the scouts actually responded with one word at the same time: kill! This was a kind of power that made people's scalps tingle. The knights who were trying their best to resist were instantly suppressed. They weren't wooden people. Each of them kept swinging their swords, trying their best to resist the attacks of the scouts. But for some reason, these knights didn't have any desire to win. Instead, the first thought that came to their minds was to retreat. We can't retreat. Forward! Charge! Kill them all. We still have a lot of people. The 3 advanced knights had more battle experience after all. As they shouted these words to stabilize the morale, they rushed to the front line and firmly stared at the pressure of the attack. Block the way out and press forward, Sodeler shouted as he knocked away the approaching knights with his sword. Then, he personally rushed to the front of the formation, leading the troops to forcefully push the line that had just stabilized. There was no room for any hesitation or luck on the battlefield. Sodeler had just knocked away 2 people when he was hit by the sword of the advanced knight. With a bang, the battle aura exploded, and Sodeler was almost thrown off his horse. The difference in strength was insurmountable, especially in a head-on battle like this. But even so, Sodeler gritted his teeth, gripped his sword, clamped his legs around the horse's belly, and charged at the enemy again. But this time, the holy shield appeared, allowing him to easily withstand the enemy's attack. The rays of light that appeared instantly boosted the morale of the cavalry. Akasha seemed to be madly casting Holy Shield, Recovery, and Elementary Healing without any regard for the cost. Then, she tore open the scrolls and cast the curse on the knights who were trying their best to resist the siege, fear, confusion, fatigue. The strength of the knights who were blocked at the crossroads was immediately greatly weakened. Originally, they still had some morale to resist, but when some of them turned around and fled because of the fear curse, the morale of the entire army immediately fell to the bottom. The siege at the crossroads was a standard tactical surround 3 and kill 1 from a tactical point of view. This kind of terrain could not only magnify the pressure from 3 directions, but also leave a path of retreat so that the enemies would not fight to the death in despair. The defensive line began to become precarious. If not for the 3 advanced knights struggling to hold on, perhaps it would have already collapsed. But because of their existence, the battle that should have ended directly gradually fell into a stalemate. This was also the first time this cavalry regiment had fought to a draw with the enemy in a face-to-face battle. In the eyes of outsiders, although these cavalry regiments that had not advanced were praiseworthy enough, such a battle record was absolutely a disgrace to the scouts who had experienced countless battles. But this couldn't be helped. Although there were only 3 advanced knights, no matter who it was, in the face of their longswords, they could only rely on the Holy Shield to defend. They didn't even have a chance to counterattack. Time passed, but the situation was becoming more and more unfavorable for Sodeler and the others. In the distance, there were already soldiers who had discovered the movement here, and they shouted for more soldiers to surround them. Hold on a little longer and they're dead. The advanced knights all realized the turning point of the battle, and immediately shouted loudly, trying to raise the morale. The compressed defensive line began to bounce back. The knights who were initially a little weaker actually managed to push the scouts out of the defensive line bit by bit. As for those knights who were affected by the fear debuff, they also regained their senses after the effect wore off and rejoined the battle. Every second that passed, the situation was turning a little. However, amidst the hustle and bustle of the battlefield, everyone had forgotten one thing: the guy who had led them here had disappeared. Talent column. In the shadows, Roddy added the new talent point after the upgrade to Enhanced Concentration Shooting. At this point, Enhanced Concentration Shooting had been strengthened by 4 talent points, and the effect was reduce casting time by 4 seconds, increase maximum damage by 40%. Level 2 Concentration Shooting itself increased the base damage, and Enhanced Concentration Shooting increased the talent by 40%, and Eagle's Eye Ring increased it by another 25%. All in all, the total damage bonus was actually a shocking 77%. Lifting the epic Frost Stinger, Roddy pulled out the last explosive arrow in the quiver, and the Eagle's Eye Ring on his wrist emitted a faint light when it was activated. When Concentration Shooting, which needed 6 seconds to cast, was reduced to 2 seconds, this skill completely began to change. On the battlefield, an advanced knight who had just defeated Carter suddenly turned his head. As he was 2 levels higher than Roddy, he instinctively sensed the danger, but his body was riding on a warhorse, and his dodging movement was shaky for half a second. However, in that split second of hesitation, his chest was blasted open by the exploding arrow in the next instant. Chapter 243. Due to the protection of battle aura and armor, advanced knights' defense was far stronger than ordinary knights. Ordinary attacks could even be considered ineffective. Therefore, the existence of 3 advanced knights could be called flags. For this mixed army, as long as they did not fall, their morale would not drop. However, at that moment, Roddy's arrow had easily killed an advanced knight. The knights, who had just raised their morale, were all dumbfounded. This arrow was far from the end of the nightmare, but it was the beginning of a series of terrible attacks. Puff! An arrow pierced into the abdomen of a knight, and the special effect of a frost spike was triggered. A large piece of hexagonal frost condensed on the metal armor, causing the knight to groan and clutch his stomach. 3 seconds later, the second arrow nailed into the head of the knight beside him. With a caw sound, the helmet was completely penetrated, causing the dead knight to fall from his horse. When this happened, the other knights thought that it was caused by the 10 scouts who were standing on the roof, but then they realized that the scouts were long gone. Muffled groans sounded one after another. Every 3 seconds, one of the knights at the front of the battle would be shot by an arrow. Some were shot in the shoulder, and because they could not lift their swords, they were cut down by the scouts. Others were shot in the throat and died on the spot. 1 or 2 knights were considered normal casualties, but when 5 knights died and 7 others were injured to varying degrees, they began to realize that the archer standing in the shadows was probably far more terrifying than the cavalry in front of them. The arrows were still shooting at a steady pace. The interval of more than 3 seconds was very regular, but the knights were like birds that were startled by the mere twang of a bowstring, and their movements became timid after 15 consecutive arrows hit the target. Roddy naturally put on the 3rd arrow in his quiver and looked at the cooldown bar of concentration shooting. When the cooldown was over, he activated the skill again. The effect of rapid shooting was to increase basic attack speed by 5%, and each hit increased attack speed by 2% at most 10 times. Previously, he had already completed 10 stacks, so at this time, Roddy's skill release speed was increased by 25% on the basis of 2 seconds, and it only took him a second and a half to complete the preparation. The seemingly ordinary arrow actually had its power increased by 52%, 12% concentration shooting plus 40% talent bonus. When Roddy shot this arrow, his target was the advanced knight facing Sodeler. Caw! The arrow suddenly hit the knight's armor. Since Roddy had shot so many arrows, the opponent had long been aware of his existence, so he had predicted this attack and firmly blocked it with his metal armor. But when the arrow bounced off the armor, the huge force still caused the knight's center of gravity to suddenly shift. The advanced knight only frowned slightly after losing his center of gravity for a mere 1 second. He wasn't worried that the second arrow would come at him at that moment, but he guessed wrong. Not only did Roddy shoot another arrow, he also shot a 3rd arrow under the buff of rapid shooting. The previous series of slow shots were all a feint. Concentration shooting combined with extreme speed shooting was Roddy's real trump card. The last 2 arrows shot out of the quiver landed at almost the same point, piercing through the advanced knight's neck at a distance of 27 meters. His corpse fell off the horse with a plop and fell in front of Sodeler. 2 out of the 3 advanced knights had died within 2 minutes. Such a huge blow had completely destroyed the morale of the team that had just been boosted, causing them to completely crumble. Kill! On the other hand, the scouts who had never retreated instantly had their morale greatly boosted. They roared loudly and almost crazily pushed the enemy back. Roddy's arrows were all shot, and the enemies on the battlefield began to completely collapse because of his last 3 arrows. Akasha! Save them! Reserve team evacuate! Orders sounded one after another. The soldiers who had been shooting arrows on the rooftops immediately rushed into the battlefield to treat the wounded. The battle just now was extremely dangerous, and it could even be said to be a tough battle that the scouts had never encountered before. Of the 50 people who went into battle, more than 30 were injured, and 11 of them had extremely serious injuries. On the other hand, of the 43 enemies, 30 were either dead or seriously injured. They could only hold on until now because they believed that reinforcements would arrive soon. However, the death of the 2 advanced knights was the straw that broke the camel's back, and the situation that originally had hope collapsed in an instant. Under normal circumstances, this battle would have been a lose-lose situation. However, the potion left by Ansadin played a heaven-defying role at this time. The entire team had not died until the enemy was defeated. Akasha drank 2 bottles of intermediate magic potion and used all her strength to pull the seriously injured soldiers back from the brink of death. All the intermediate healing potion that had been distributed had been used up, and some people even drank 4 bottles. If calculated in terms of numbers, the HP recovered by the divine arts and potion was already twice the total HP of the entire team. This kind of thing had always happened to elite PvE players, but Roddy relied on his own preparation to forcibly turn his team into such a tenacious and undying army. However, the potion and divine arts were not omnipotent. Their effects would be greatly weakened by continuous use. Although many of the seriously injured soldiers had survived, they had completely lost the ability to fight. At least 7 people in the entire team were forcibly carried onto the warhorses, but until the moment they left, the cavalry did not give up on any of their comrades, and all of them followed the team. This time, it was a real retreat. Whether it was the soldiers or the warhorses, at this time, their physical strength was close to the limit, and there was no point in continuing to fight. Roddy also rode on a warhorse, and together with Ruger, they followed at the rear of the team. At this time, he was also exhausted, and did not even have much strength left to draw his bow. Even his fingers holding the reins were trembling slightly. Catch! Seeing the huge wound on Ruger's left shoulder, Roddy raised his hand and threw his healing potion to Ruger. Ruger reached out and caught it. Without saying anything, he pulled out the stopper and drank the 6th bottle of potion that he had drunk today. A little color returned to his pale face. They are surrounding us, and the cavalry knows where we are going. Luga looked around and shouted to Roddy, "Don't worry. Speed up, don't fall behind. If those guys have brains, we will definitely be able to escape." Roddy's answer made Ruger a little confused, but at this time, he was in no mood to think about other problems. He just tried to coordinate his tired body with the warhorse, and followed closely behind the team towards the south of the town. We actually let them escape again? Earl Durant listened to the soldier's eyewitness report, and he did not hide the shock in his voice. Earl Owen's eyelids trembled a few times, and the other lords also looked at each other. They really could not figure out how an elite cavalry regiment, with the help of an elementalist, together with thousands of soldiers, could repeatedly fail to besiege a team of less than 100 people. The shock did not last long, and the successive news almost made these lords' jaws drop. Mage Cohen is dead. The cavalry regiment suffered heavy losses, only 9 people returned. Knight Forley is dead. Knight Buffalo is dead. These 2 knights were the advanced knights that Earl Owen had always been proud of. When he first sent out the 3 advanced knights, the worst that he had expected was that the pursuit would fail, but he never thought that the losses would be so serious. Are they all dead? Earl Durant swallowed his saliva, and his tone even had a slight tremble, as if he was a chicken that had been pinched by the neck. The enemy is retreating out of the town. They are still at full strength, and there are currently no reports of casualties. If the previous news had already surprised the lords, this news made them feel an indescribable chill from the bottom of their hearts. The lethality of the sentence, "no casualties," was too terrible. 3 layers of defense, 2 encirclements, a total of more than 800 soldiers, and so far there was not a single death. This sounded incredible. Because they did not personally witness the scene of the battle, the lords could not judge the combat strength of these cavalrymen. But from the news that was reported now, could it be that their strength was stronger than the advanced knights? Although they did not believe such a possibility, the facts were placed in front of them, and they had to make a similar judgment and quickly change their strategy in fear. We can't fight them in the town. There must be something wrong. Pull all the troops out of the town and surround them in the open. Even if we have to use our numbers to overwhelm them, we can't let them escape. Hatred was one thing, and self-doubt was another. Every lord had suffered a loss in the hands of this team, but if they really wanted to fight, they absolutely did not have the courage to face it head-on. That was the reason why Rhodey wanted to carry out a battle of annihilation in the town. Only by using thunderous means to make them feel pain and fear would his team be able to take the initiative in a disadvantageous situation and tip the scales of victory. As the saying went, of the 36 stratagems, retreat is the best stratagem. Many people simply understood it as run if you can't beat them, but Roddy was very clear that the real meaning of retreat was to prepare for counterattack through retreat. From appearing outside Gigtown until now, Roddy had completed the 3 initial goals he had set: save his soldiers, let the weak troops retreat, and concentrate the superior forces to annihilate the enemy's elite troops. Chapter 244. While Roddy's cavalry regiment was sprinting all the way out of Kegtown, the 5 lords did not stay idle. They also led their troops to outflank the south side of the town. Earl Owen moved forward silently in the team, followed by his last advance knight. He knew very well that although his team still had some fighting strength, the only trump card that could make the final blow was this loyal knight beside him. If he wanted to turn the tables, this knight named Gree was his only hope. The successive defeats made Owen furious. When he looked at the dust stirred up by the cavalrymen in the distance, he pondered for a moment and finally made up his mind. He reached into the deepest pocket of his clothes and took out an extremely small crystal bottle. "Gree, take this." The advanced knight was skilled in horsemanship. He immediately followed and reached out to hold the bottle containing the bright green liquid. "Master, what is this?" "Take it. Your battle aura will always be at its strongest state for a short period of time, and it can be used indefinitely." Earl Owen's words shocked Gree. The battle aura of a knight was not like the magic power of a mage. Battle aura was consumed quickly and recovered quickly. Therefore, the knight profession had strong endurance but very low explosive power. Except for ghost knights like Wellington, few knights could burst out a lot of damage in a short period of time. But this bottle of rare potion personally made by Ansadin was extremely heaven-defying. The effect of unlimited use of battle aura for a short period of time could let Gree burst out several times his usual fighting strength. Gree was not stupid. After a little thought, he understood Earl Owen's plan. He nodded and silently hid the potion in his arms. "Lord Ansadin, I've done my best." As he whispered these words in his heart, Sodeler's cavalry appeared in front of him. For Roddy's team, the situation at this time was very bad. The soldiers' injuries were more serious than expected. Many of them had basically lost their fighting strength. More importantly, the whole team's physical strength was greatly reduced. The warhorses had gone through at least 4 battles, almost holding their breath from beginning to end. They did not even drink a few mouthfuls of water during the few minutes of rest in between. Anyone who knew a thing or two about horses would know that if the horses continued to run like this, there was a high chance that the horses would run to death. Sodeler naturally knew this, so when the entire army retreated, he did his best to choose a flat and open street. At the same time, he didn't run with all his might. He knew very well that at this time, the army couldn't fall into disarray. Otherwise, the morale of the army would be shaken and the consequences would be unthinkable. However, being slow meant that there was a possibility of being surrounded. It was not difficult to rush out of Gigtown because the enemy did not have time to react. However, after rushing out of Gigtown, a large number of cavalry troops quickly caught up with them with the advantage of speed. The southern part of Kygertown was next to an open plain, 3 kilometers away from the forest. In this era, no one had ever specially built roads. 4 warhorses, the black and soft dirt road was far less comfortable than the hard dirt road in Gigtown. The warhorse's panting grew heavier as it ran out of stamina. Sodeler furrowed his brows. He was at the very front of the group, but he could see at least 3 cavalry squads speeding up from the rear. On the left, there was also a platoon of armed infantry blocking in front of them, in a forceful attempt to intercept them. The rumbling sound of horse hooves approached from both sides. 70 to 80 knights, who were full of energy, quickly caught up with them. Then, they gradually came to a distance of 100 meters from both sides, advancing parallel to Sodeler and the others. Then, they sped up and prepared to encircle them in front. Rush over. Luge, who was at the back of the army, looked worried and turned to ask Roddy. This is the only way. Roddy frowned slightly, but then added, what should be done has been done. If there really is no other way, we can only resign ourselves to fate. Luge silently pulled out his scimitar and spat out a mouthful of bloody saliva. Even if we die, there is nothing to regret. The old soldier's words were sonorous and powerful, but at the same time, it also caused Roddy to be a little dazed. He never thought that he could lead a group of useless scouts to this step, killing orcs, killing undead, and even fighting traitors without being at a disadvantage. Through the experience of war, this troop already had a soul that other noble troops never had. Not only were they war machines that obeyed orders, but they also had an awareness that ordinary soldiers did not have. The scouts always believed that what they were doing was absolutely correct, and they felt honored to carry out Roddy's orders 100%. This awareness made all the scouts have the same thought as Luge. Up to this point in the battle, they had no regrets. The cavalry troops on both sides gradually completed the encirclement, and the hundreds of infantries in front of the road also raised their spears, forming a dense phalanx to resist the cavalry. Seeing this situation, Sodeler's reaction was to raise his longsword high and give the order to prepare for battle. However, when they were still 200 meters away from the infantries, Roddy narrowed his eyes slightly. He looked past the enemies blocking the front and stared at the edge of the forest 2 kilometers away. Then, he slowly breathed a sigh of relief and gave the order to the front of the troops to slow down. On the other side, the approaching lords thought that they would see the cavalry and the encirclement troops fighting, but the troops that suddenly emerged from the forest made them collectively stunned for a moment. A team of more than 20 people ran out of the forest and galloped towards the infantry platoon that was in formation. From their clothes, they were actually the guys who had just escaped from Town. What was this? Rushing back to die? Just a mere 20 people, even if they were all elite cavalry, in the face of more than 300 mixed infantry and cavalry troops, rushing over was like moths flying into a flame. Baron Howard sneered. Hey, could it be that they know their fate and are ready to die together with that Baron? But as soon as he said this, he could no longer smile. Behind this small team, a team of more cavalry suddenly emerged from the forest, and this team unfurled a large flag in the cold wind, causing the lords to be completely dumbfounded. The Frost Wolf head emblem. The emblem of the Lucifron family. When they looked at the front of this team, the 2 guardian knights that were like giants made everyone hold their breath. It was Wellington and Titus. The 2 most powerful people in EFTA territory charged side by side. The aura that belonged to the strong made the lords feel a chill from 800 meters away. What's going on? Why would Angmar interfere? Didn't they say that Wellington and Titus went to the northwest fortress? This situation caught them off guard. During the pre-war intelligence investigation, there was no evidence that Angmar was interested in Town. But at this time, 2 powerful guardian knights suddenly appeared and interfered with the battle. Even if they thought with their knees, they knew that the other party was definitely not here to help them. Naturally, they did not know that Natha and the others escaped from the town in advance was completely Roddy's deliberate action. The main purpose was to enter the forest and lead the possible reinforcements to the correct position. Roddy received a letter from Angmar 3 or 4 days ago, which mentioned that Roddy was in a critical situation. He was ready to send reinforcements at any time. And in this situation, Roddy bet that this duke would have the courage to send reinforcements to him. Obviously, he won the bet. However, while Roddy was happy, the few nobles were dumbfounded. What should they do next? The lords looked at each other in dismay. Baron Howard already had the intention to retreat, but Durant and Earl Owen's eyes revealed a hint of determination. Surround them first. As long as Angmar is not here, there is still room for negotiation. Earl Owen gritted his teeth and rushed forward. He did not think about negotiation at all. Instead, he was thinking about how to get rid of these guys as soon as possible. Logically speaking, after the 2 Guardian Knights joined the battlefield, these nobles had no reason to continue fighting. Because if anyone dared to make a move, it would be completely disrespecting the Dukes of Angmar. And the consequences of not giving face to the old Duke was definitely not something an ordinary person could bear. As a result, the troops that were originally prepared to surround them immediately slowed down. The originally tense atmosphere on the battlefield was suddenly diluted, and the galloping horses gradually came to a halt. The 3 forces gradually occupied the 3 sides of the battlefield. The situation fell into a stalemate and confrontation. But in this situation, the troops of the lords still had an absolute advantage. In addition to the 100 guards, the 200 cavalry and infantry that had rushed over previously made them appear to have a large number, and the continuous flow of infantry at the back was more than 1,000. In contrast, the soldiers of Roddy and Wellington added up to only a little more than 100 people. Under such an encirclement, it was obvious that they were at a disadvantage. The battle ends here. Duke Lucifron does not want to see any bad fighting in his territory. Knight Titus walked out of the ranks and said to the 5 gloomy lords, Baron Sodeler and his team are the targets of our escort. Now they need to return to Hollier City. Lords, please make way and cooperate. This tone made the faces of the lords change several times. Titus had no intention of giving them face at all. It was a completely, I'm here, hurry up and get lost posture. However, Baron Howard and the few lesser lords really did not dare to say anything. Although they had previously said that Angmar is almost done for and Efta is about to collapse, when they really met the 2 Guardian Knights with their power, they had no choice but to admit defeat. Knight Titus, I think this is a little inappropriate. Earl Durant had lost the elementalist Cohen, and at this time, he simply hated Sodeler to the core. So he shouted angrily, Baron Sodeler took the initiative to start a war in Gigtown and fought with us. If you want to leave, I think the 2 knights should also wait for us to solve this problem before leaving, right? This was actually nonsense. Everyone was testing each other to see their attitude. I am here under the orders of Lord Duke. If you have any other opinions, you can raise them to Duke, but now, I am only here to carry out the orders. Titus's lance in his hand swayed a few times intentionally or unintentionally, his expression cold. Chapter 245. Earl Owen's attitude was tough. Obviously, he didn't want to discuss anything with Wellington. He had completely fallen out with him. Seeing this, Earl Durant also gritted his teeth and ordered his soldiers to join in the encirclement. They must stand on the same side at this time. If they let Sodeler escape today, they would definitely be in serious trouble in the future. Even if they had to face the wrath of Angmar and pay a heavy price, they must achieve this goal. The 2 earls, together with the 2 puppet barons, had more than 100 cavalrymen. There were also more than 300 infantrymen surrounding them. Under the layers of encirclement, they were obviously prepared to fight a decisive battle with Roddy's army. Knight Titus looked at all this expressionlessly. He didn't have any intention to ask any questions. He just silently returned to his troops and raised his lance, preparing for battle. He and Wellington rushed all the way from Hollier City to here. Because they were in a hurry, they only brought 60 cavalrymen. Compared to Roddy's troops, there were only 140 cavalrymen. If they were to fight, they would be at a disadvantage no matter what. At this time, Roddy came to the front from the end of the line. His figure didn't stand out among the strong scouts. The dust and cracks on his armor made Roddy look very embarrassed. However, the besieging soldiers quickly recognized the guy who had played them for a fool in Kiger Town. After hearing a brief report, Earl Owen couldn't help but squint his eyes. There's actually such a person. Why haven't I heard of him before? Amazing archery. It seems that Cohen was killed by him. Earl Durant was full of anger and had nowhere to vent it. He stared at Roddy, then turned to Wellington and Titus, who were preparing for battle. He loudly said, "If the Dukes of Angmar insist on not giving us face, then please be prepared to pay the price. Although my soldiers can't beat you, I want to see how many people you can save." Humph! Titus hated being threatened the most. Therefore, he just stared at Owen. At the same time, he raised his pure metal lance. With his abundant battle chi, the entire body of the lance gave out white light patterns. This was a sign that the strength of an advanced knight had reached the bottleneck. Even though Gris, who was beside Owen, was also an advanced knight, he could only make his dagger glow a little. As for the pure metal lance, he could barely control it, let alone make it glow. Wellington was not as impulsive as Titus. He placed the tip of his spear on the ground with a look of indifference and reached out to tidy up the secondary weapons on the saddle. The silent intimidation of the two guardian knights was far more direct than any nonsense. Everyone present understood that if these two wanted to kill someone, no one would be able to stop them. Sodeler was silent. He lowered his head and wrapped the hilt of his long sword with a strip of cloth. He was a little exhausted from the previous battle, so he did this to prevent losing his weapon in the upcoming battle. Only by being in this team could one truly experience their amazing cohesiveness and terrifying willpower. Even the Templar Knights who had fought alongside each other for a short period of time started to recuperate fearlessly and prepared for the final battle. Why did they come back with the team? Roddy turned his head and looked at Brody and Natha, who had led the team back. He was puzzled. Previously, he had only let this team that had escaped lead the way for the reinforcements, but he did not ask them to come back and die with him. It was understandable that the other soldiers were willing to come back, but what was up with these two wood elves? When you need help, there is no reason for me to stand by and do nothing. Brody was a typical wood elf. In his heart, he had never thought of changing the direction of the wind. What was right, what was wrong, and what should be done, even if it meant death. It sounded a little stupid, but this was the difference between them and humans. Natha did not speak. She looked elsewhere, as if she was unwilling to look at Roddy. But her fingers that were holding the short bow were a little pale. The atmosphere of the entire battlefield was like a taut string, as if it would snap in the next second. But no one expected that at this moment there was a sound of hooves coming from the north of Gig Town. The lords had thought that it was the subordinate knights who had finished reorganizing, but when they looked over, they found that the other party was actually very powerful. Although there were only 15 knights coming, the flag in their hands had a symbol that made Owen and Earl Durant's pupils shrink. Crossed roses, holy crosses. This meant that they were Templar Knights belonging to the Rose Cross sect. Damn it! Although the other party did not have many people, the power that they represented was more of a headache to the lords than Angmar. The nobles could negotiate with interests, but the Rose Cross could not. When it came to the undead, they never had the slightest room for compromise. Why did they appear today? Weren't they supposed to arrive on the 12th? The consecutive accidents had completely disrupted Earl Owen's plan. At this moment, he found that he had no other choice. He raised his eyes and pointed at Sodeler, Roddy, and the others. Without hesitation, he roared at his troops, "Kill them! Don't think about the consequences. Gree, it's up to you." His eyes met the subordinate knight's for a second. The latter nodded slightly and put his hand into his pocket. "Akasha shield. Cavalry regiment, advance." On the other side, Roddy also turned around and gave the order, but then he found that Akasha was frowning with a pale face. Because of the continuous use of magic potions, she was now suffering from a severe headache. But when she heard Roddy's words, she still forced herself to maintain the holy shield for Roddy. "I can still hold on for a while." Akasha's voice was abnormally weak. "I remember what you said, to maintain half of your magic power." What Akasha said after that, Roddy could not hear because the sound of hooves around them had begun to become louder. Wellington and Titus were already prepared. They immediately led their troops to intercept these crazy guys. In the chaos, the second holy shield shone on Sodeler's body. The Baron took the lead and rushed to the forefront, leading the whole cavalry regiment to charge. At this time, Owen and Earl Durant's troops were basically blocked by Wellington and the others. Roddy and Sodeler were ready to attack from the side. But after only 10 seconds, Wellington's cavalry troops were forcibly broken through with a boom. The strength of the two Guardian Knights was beyond doubt, but the other knights who came with Wellington and the others were not elites. Therefore, in a face-to-face confrontation, the soldiers in front of Knight Gree were directly broken through by him. His strength had increased several times under the effect of the potion. The almost extravagant use of battle aura made him seem like the incarnation of a sharp blade, directly penetrating the battle formation. Wellington and Titus, who were rushing in front, could not turn back at this time. They could not help but feel bad. The battlefield was changing rapidly. No one thought that Gree would have a master-level potion made by Ansadin. Boom! Sodeler rushed in front, so he was the first to bear the direct impact of Gree's holy shield. The light of Gree's holy shield was directly shattered by Gree's lance. The tip of the lance was affected by the shield and slightly tilted, brushing past Sodeler's shoulder. Although it did not poke a hole in him, the whistling battle aura caused a lot of sputtering damage, almost breaking his entire arm. If Sodeler had not tightly clamped his warhorse, he would have been directly blown away. All of this happened in a split second. Sodeler's casual attack hit Gree, but it was completely blocked by that surging battle chi. With a clang, it left a dent on Gree's breastplate. After one round, Sodeler was slightly injured, but Gree was not injured at all. Gree continued to charge, the lance in his hand already aimed at Roddy. He knew very well that these two people in front of him were Earl Owen's greatest enemies. As long as he could successfully kill them, he would have completed his mission. He shouted angrily. Then, he saw a large swaying plant suddenly rise from the ground in front of his warhorse. It was about to trip his warhorse, but he was not afraid at all. He fiercely swung his lance and with a schwa sound, he used his battle aura to cut the plant in front of him into pieces. Pa! Natha gritted her teeth and shot an arrow at his chest, but it was also bounced off by his tough battle aura. Akasha's eyes widened. She knew that it was too late to cast a spell, so she could only hurriedly reach for the remaining scroll on the side of the saddle. Die. In the blink of an eye, Gree's lance was only 3 meters away from Roddy. But in the next moment, a golden light suddenly flickered. Akasha, who hurriedly tore the scroll, felt a sudden heat on her fingers, and then a cold and powerful aura exploded in her hand. She originally thought that she had torn open a cursing scroll, but she did not expect that it was the most powerful single-target spell of a necromancer, Death Coil. Inconceivably, this scroll that could not be activated due to the profession restriction was actually successfully activated in her hands. countless skulls formed by dark shadows flew out from her fingertips, carrying with them the mournful wails of the soul. As they flew forward, Gree's lance had already come into contact with the shield in front of Roddy. The golden shield rippled, and then immediately deformed and cracked. Roddy tried his best to dodge, but with the lesson learned from Soddler's shield, Gree's arm was as steady as a mountain. When the shield was shattered, the tip of the lance did not move much, and it went straight for Roddy's chest. Everything happened in less than half a second. Everyone seemed to have foreseen the scene of Roddy's chest being pierced. However, they did not expect that the lance did not pierce through Roddy's chest. Instead, it was sent flying away. Chapter 246. In just 30 seconds, Earl Owen deeply experienced the pleasure of falling from heaven to hell. Gree's unstoppable momentum made him smile, but the appearance of the entanglement of death froze his sneer on his face. Earl Durant, who was next to him, had long been speechless. His troops had been stopped by Wellington and Titus. The soldiers were no match for the two Guardian Knights at all. Almost in just a face-to-face confrontation, their morale had been crushed. The difference in strength was too great. In the melee, the strength of Wellington and Titus was undoubtedly highlighted. In the past, it was not obvious in a one-on-one fight, but in a densely packed environment, within the attack range of the two metal lances, almost no one could get close. From another point of view, the two knights were completely like two harvesters, waving their lances as they moved forward, completely at a rhythm that would send anyone who came into contact with them flying. They had originally planned to turn around to help Roddy, but when they turned around, they saw that Gree had been run over by Roddy's troop. Only then did they feel relieved to continue fighting. They could be considered to have restrained themselves and basically did not use any ruthless attack. After knocking out and sending flying the enemies in front of them, the originally weak knights quickly lost their fighting spirit. Many of them even stopped in their tracks, timidly not daring to move forward. Earl Owen's face was livid, and he was completely panicked. He did not expect Gree's failure at all. The fluctuation of the entanglement of death almost made Owen's heart stop beating. As a puppet, he was extremely sensitive to the undead spell, so he could not figure out why a delicate beauty could cast the entanglement of death. What happened to this world? She was just using the holy shield, just now. Undead spell and divine incantation completely stood on the opposite side of the spell system. This was something everyone knew. But what the hell was going on in front of him? But what was even more surprising was that the Rose Cross troops that Earl Owen was extremely afraid of were all gathering in front of Roddy. These troops holding the Rose Cross flag were different from each other. It seemed that they had come from various towns in the territory, but they all had a very unified action. They all rushed in front of the figure carrying the short bow, and then bowed to salute. Who is he? Owen and Durant were completely dumbfounded. They had always treated Soddler as their enemy, but they never thought that the one who planned and led the operation was actually this inconspicuous archer. Owen immediately realized that he had lost the upper hand. He turned around and was about to retreat, but when he looked at the forest behind him, he saw a large group of more than 300 Temple Knights from Hollier City slowly approaching. Unknowingly, Owen realized that he had been surrounded. "We still have room for discussion, Roddy's words interrupted Durant. He switched his title from The Last Witcher to Templar Guard Captain. Looking at the words, regional recruitment successful, he sneered. We don't need to show any mercy to traitors who collude with the undead. The Count still wanted to say something, but in the face of the menacing paladins, his lips trembled, and his face turned completely ashen. Earl Owen did not believe that Roddy would really dare to kill him. He immediately shouted, I am an earl, a noble, I have the right. Yes, you bastard. Roddy was not interested in giving this guy a chance to talk nonsense. He waved his scimitar. Kill! Such an arrogant style was not the style of a noble, but because of his ruthlessness, the lords who were originally on Owen's side instantly broke out in cold sweat. Only then did they understand that this seemingly insignificant person actually had the authority to command all of the temple knights. According to the rank, this was the power that only a superintendent bishop could have. Earl Durant completely gave up hope and slumped on the saddle. So what if he was an earl? The noble system and the church were two completely different things. These religious lunatics would not give him any face at all. Earl Owen looked at the temple knights surging towards him in a daze. His mind was completely unable to think about everything that had happened. Territory, wealth, women, and the desire for revenge. All of these completely disappeared with the roar of the hooves. Aaron Calendar, Year 588, November 10th. The injured soldiers groaned in the houses. Hundreds of bodies were dragged out of the town by the heavy footsteps of the engineers and buried. The weather was cold, and these bodies had not yet decomposed. However, the ravens hovering in the sky were flocks, and the depressed atmosphere made the temperature drop a lot. There were not many traces of fighting in Gigtown. Some of the smashed shop doors had been simply repaired at this time. The atmosphere on the streets was still solemn. Because there was no announcement and no noble came out, people still trembled with fear and did not dare to go out. They could not be sure whether there would be a similar war again. In the manor left by Ancidin, Roddy, who had not slept all night, was still forcing himself to write a letter. After the battle, he had ordered all his exhausted subordinates to rest. After discussing the future development with Sodeler in the middle of the night, he was the only one left in the study. Seeing that the sky outside the window was already bright, Roddy stretched out his hand and extinguished the lamp wick. His fingertips were almost numb after a long battle. He rubbed his eyes and glanced at the snapping turtle Nokia that looked like a paperweight on the table. He exhaled tiredly, then picked up a few pieces of firewood and threw them into the fireplace. He stared at the jumping fire in a daze. After the battle, it was supposed to be the time to reap the rewards. However, Roddy did not feel much excitement. This battle was completely on the verge of destruction. If the other forces had not made adjustments, he would have been the one buried in the graveyard outside. There was still a lingering fear in his heart. When the fear struck, Roddy always felt a deep sense of powerlessness. Just a few nobles with a few broken knights could almost kill him. If it were not for Ancidin's potions and Akasha's support, this team would not have been able to maintain a zero casualty rate. I still need time, but time is really running out. With a sigh, Roddy reviewed yesterday's battle and summed up the gains and losses. This battle killed Earl Owen directly. Not only him, but even the two puppet barons were all trampled into meat paste, and their bodies could not even be put back together. Their death also meant that the most important puppets in Ifta's territory had all been uprooted by Roddy. Earl Durante did not die, and this was the result of the game between the parties. Titus brought Angmar's words, and the general idea was that not too many nobles should die, or else it would cause more trouble than gain. Roddy naturally had no objection, but before he left, he still shot the traitor with a hidden arrow and crippled him. His vengeful nature had never changed, and it was definitely not his style not to take revenge. Howard and the other barons retreated dejectedly. Roddy did not treat them as prisoners of war for ransom, which was already giving face to the Dukes of Angmar. But he did not hesitate to take half of the supplies they brought, so the three nobles could only grit their teeth and roll back to their territory dejectedly. The two Guardian Knights prepared to return with their troops today. According to the message they conveyed, Gigtown was directly given to Sodeler. In addition, the knights under Tranka were also ordered by Duke to sign a contract with Sodeler. No matter how many knights would eventually fulfill the contract, this was already a very generous return. In this way, the wealth of Sodeler's territory was already in the upper middle of Ifta's territory. For Roddy's strategic policy, this was definitely a big step. Glancing at the experience bar, the 110,000 experience gained from such a large-scale battle was not a lot as his level was getting higher and higher. But he was very concerned about the changes after his team had accumulated enough experience. After fighting Ancidin, Magda, and now defeating the traitors of the kingdom's cavalry, all the scouts had reached the basic level of 10. Next, he had to start thinking about how to change the class of these scouts. After sitting for a long time, Roddy hammered his stiff back, then squatted down and continued to daydream. At this moment, there was a knock on the study's wooden door. "Come in." Roddy's voice was a little hoarse. Turning his head, he saw that the person who came was Natha. Last night, he specially apologized to Brody sincerely for a long time, but he did not expect the old village chief to not reprimand him. Instead, he mentioned something else. Roddy suddenly thought of the book Brody gave him, and for a moment, he was a little lost in thought. Looking at Natha outside the door for a full 3 to 5 seconds, he finally reacted and coughed dryly. What's the matter?" Only then did he remember that Natha had not spoken to him since yesterday. When this wood elf walked in with a cold face, Roddy, who was squatting on the ground, wanted to stand up, but because his muscles were so sore, he almost sat on the ground. It took him a long time to get up. In the past, such a pathetic appearance would have been laughable, but Natha understood what this fellow in front of her had done. He had led dozens of people into the town to rescue his team, single-handedly lured over 100 soldiers away, and forcibly opened up a path of escape. In the end, he had even gathered all his forces and defeated over 1,000 enemies. If one did not personally experience and witness such a feat, it was likely that no one would believe it. Therefore, when she saw Roddy's haggard and exhausted appearance, an unprecedented sense of respect arose in her heart. Before this, Natha admired Roddy's abilities and admired Roddy's archery skills. But after yesterday's incident, she sincerely admired Roddy as a person. Because of this admiration, she decided to come here just to say a few words to Roddy. "Teacher." Natha bowed. She had addressed him this way before, but it was definitely not from the bottom of her heart as she did today. In a daze, Roddy recalled the teacher iceberg in his memory. Back then, he had initially been unconvinced by the colder and more mature-looking Natha. However, as he interacted with her for a long time and witnessed Natha fight several times, he was completely convinced and put away the contempt in his heart. Instead, there was a sense of reverence in his heart. Looking at Natha before him, Roddy felt as though he was looking at his past self. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.